She was the youngest CEO in automotive history, and tonight, someone wanted her dead. When the lights died inside Titan Apex Motors' most classified facility, Vivian Sterling had exactly 3 seconds to realize that her 12-person security team, men she paid 6 figures to protect her, were already walking out the door. Not running. Walking. Like they'd been told to. That left her alone in the dark with a mechanic she barely knew, a building full of armed men who'd come prepared, and a secret buried inside a prototype car that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. This is that story. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The demonstration was supposed to last 40 minutes. That was what the itinerary said, the one Vivian Sterling's assistant had printed on heavy cardstock and placed inside each executive's welcome folder that morning. 4 p.m. Closed prototype demonstration, Track A. Duration, 40 minutes. Access level, restricted. Neat, professional. The kind of document that made everything look controlled. Vivian had approved that itinerary herself, standing in her corner office on the 14th floor of Titan Apex's headquarters, with a cup of coffee she never actually drank going cold on her desk. She'd read it twice, changed one word, presentation to demonstration, because she hated the implication that they were selling something they hadn't finished yet, and initialed the bottom. That was 8 hours before everything collapsed. The Meridian testing facility sat 43 miles outside the city, on land that Titan Apex had purchased 6 years ago, specifically because it was surrounded by nothing. No residential neighborhoods, no civilian foot traffic, just scrubland, a chain-link perimeter fence, and a 2-lane access road that most people forgot existed. The facility itself was a converted aerospace hangar. High ceilings, industrial lighting, climate-controlled bays where engineers worked in near silence on machines that hadn't been shown to the public yet. Track A was the crown jewel, a half-mile closed circuit inside the facility, surrounded by reinforced observation glass and enough sensor equipment to measure a vehicle's performance down to the millimeter. It was Vivian's favorite place in the company. She didn't say that out loud very often. CEOs weren't supposed to have favorites. She arrived at 3:15, 45 minutes early, because she always arrived early to things she cared about. Her security detail, 6 men in identical dark jackets, led by a former federal agent named Harris, who communicated mostly in nods, swept the facility in 15 minutes and declared it clean. Vivian walked the track perimeter herself after that, not because she doubted them, but because she needed the movement. She was nervous, not in a visible way. She'd spent the better part of a decade learning to keep that particular voltage somewhere below the surface. But she was nervous. The Meridian prototype was the first vehicle the company had developed entirely under her leadership. 3 years of work, 2 complete redesigns, a team of 68 engineers who'd each put something of themselves into the machine sitting in Bay 7, draped in a charcoal cover that cost more than most people's monthly rent. If the demonstration went well tonight, they'd move into final testing in 2 weeks. If it didn't, she didn't finish that thought. "It's going to go fine," said a voice behind her. Vivian turned. The man crouching beside the rear left wheel well of the prototype, with a pressure gauge in one hand and a small flashlight clenched between his teeth, was not someone she immediately recognized. That bothered her more than she showed. She made a point of learning names. He was maybe 6'1", built in that particular way that suggested he'd carried heavy things for a long time. Not gym muscle, but worked muscle, the kind that came from actual use. Dark hair, cut close. A face that hadn't fully decided how old it was. He wore a Titan Apex mechanics uniform, the dark gray one with the yellow stripe at the collar, and his sleeves were pushed up to the elbow, even though the hanger ran cool. "I'm sorry?" Vivian said. He took the flashlight out of his mouth. "The pressure's perfect. I was just double-checking." He stood, and she noticed he moved with an economy of motion that felt almost deliberate. Nothing wasted. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. You just looked like you were working something out." "I was." She paused. "And you are?" "Ethan Walker, senior prototype mechanic." He offered his hand. His grip was firm without performing firmness. "I've been assigned to the Meridian for the last 8 months." 8 months. She shook his hand and felt a small, specific irritation at herself for not knowing that. You've been on this project for 8 months and I'm just meeting you now. I'm not usually the one they put in front of executives, he said. Not defensive, just accurate. That's going to change, Vivian said, and she meant it, though she didn't elaborate. She turned back toward the track. Is everything else ready? Far as I can tell. I ran a full pre-check this morning and another one an hour ago. He hesitated for exactly half a second. There's one thing I want to look at again before we start. The steering response on the second calibration set. It was fine, but it was just fine. I'd rather have a little more margin. How long? 20 minutes. Vivian checked her watch. The executives would arrive in 30. Do it. He nodded and went back to work. She watched him for a moment, the focus, the lack of theater, and then walked back toward the observation area where her assistant was already arranging chairs. She didn't know it yet, but that conversation was the last ordinary moment of her night. The executives filed in at 4 o'clock precisely. 7 of them, from various divisions, plus Chief Security Officer Damian Cross and 2 of his senior staff. Vivian greeted each one with the practiced warmth of someone who understood that business ran on personal comfort, even when personal comfort was the last thing she felt. Damian Cross was the last to arrive. He was 51, with silver hair that he kept in a cut that somehow managed to look both military and corporate, and eyes that always seemed to be measuring something. He'd been with Titan Apex for 9 years, brought in by the previous CEO, Marcus Hale, who'd built the company from a regional parts supplier into a mid-tier automotive manufacturer before handing the reins to Vivian 3 years ago. Damian had stayed through the transition, and Vivian had kept him because his record was spotless and because institutional knowledge was worth something. Vivian. He shook her hand. His grip was always 2 degrees too firm, just enough to make a point without being obvious about it. Big night. We're ready, she said. I'm sure you are. He looked past her toward the track. Beautiful machine. Something in the way he said it, beautiful machine, made her skin register an unease she couldn't immediately explain, like a word slightly mispronounced by someone who'd only read it in books. But Damian Cross always made her slightly uneasy. She'd attributed that until now to the general atmosphere of controlled authority that security chiefs seemed to cultivate as a professional habit. She let it go. The demonstration began at 4:08. The Meridian came off the starting line cleanly, that low electric hum that sounded like power held on a very short leash, and completed the first lap without incident. The executives in the observation area made appreciative sounds. Vivian stood with her arms crossed, watching the telemetry screens more than the car itself, monitoring the numbers in real time. Speed, load distribution, brake response, battery thermal, everything was reading clean. On the second lap, the vehicle hit the hairpin at the far end of the track at approximately 72 miles per hour, a controlled approach well within design parameters, and the steering locked. Not drifted, not pulled, locked. For 3 seconds, which felt like considerably longer, the Meridian continued traveling in the direction it had been going, which was directly toward the interior barrier wall. The test driver, a 40-year veteran named Castellano who'd driven everything from Formula prototypes to military cargo vehicles, did exactly what his experience told him to do. He didn't fight the wheel. He hit the brakes hard and clean and held on. The car stopped 11 feet from the wall. The room went completely silent. Then everyone started talking at once, and Vivian walked away from the noise and stood at the edge of the observation glass and looked at the Meridian sitting at a crooked angle on the track, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not of failure. She'd been through failure before, a product recall in year 1 of her tenure, a supplier collapse that had nearly taken out Q3, a board challenge that she'd survived by 3 votes. Fear of failure was something she'd learned to metabolize into action. This was different. This was the particular fear that comes when something you were certain was solid turns out to have a cavity inside it. When the ground produces a sound that it shouldn't. Ethan Walker appeared beside her without her noticing. Steering failure, he said quietly, watching Castellano climb out of the car below them. I know. That's not what I said. He paused. I said steering failure, not steering malfunction. She turned to look at him. His jaw was set, and he was still watching the car with the expression of someone who was doing math faster than they were showing. "Explain that," she said. "Give me 20 minutes with the data recorder," he said, "and I'll tell you if I'm right about what happened." She started to respond, but her assistant touched her arm and drew her back toward the executives. And by the time she was done managing the diplomatic fallout of a failed demonstration, Ethan Walker had disappeared back toward the vehicle bay. She should have followed him then. She didn't. By 8 o'clock, most of the visitors had left. The Meridian had been towed back to Bay 7. Castellano had given a brief statement confirming that the vehicle had responded normally right up to the moment it hadn't, and then he'd headed home, too old and too experienced to be rattled by something he'd walked away from. The 7 executives had departed in a careful sequence of reassurances and professional masks, and Vivian had seen each one out personally, reading their faces, some genuinely concerned, a few already calculating what this meant politically, 1 or 2 actively hiding something that might have been relief. That last observation she filed away without commenting on it. Her internal security team, 12 people total, Harris leading, remained on site per standard protocol whenever executives visited a restricted facility after hours. Vivian had sent her assistant home at 7:30. She told herself she wanted quiet to think. That wasn't entirely untrue. What was also true was that she didn't want an audience for what she was feeling. She found Ethan Walker in the data room off Bay 7, a small, windowless space crammed with server racks and dual-screen workstations. He was sitting with his back to the door, sleeves still pushed up, and he had 3 windows open on the screen in front of him that she couldn't immediately read from where she was standing. "Find something?" she said. He didn't startle. He'd heard her coming. "Yeah." He didn't turn around right away. "Come look at this." She pulled a chair up beside him. The screens showed telemetry data from the Meridian's pre-demonstration checks. Timestamps, command logs, system inputs, and outputs. One window showed the steering control log from the moment of failure. "The steering locked because it received a command input," Ethan said. "Not from the driver, not from any internal system failure. A command was sent to the steering controller from an external signal source, and the controller executed it." Vivian looked at the screen. "That's not possible. The Meridian's drive systems are closed loop. There's no external input capability." "There is now." He zoomed in on a specific timestamp. 4:17:33 p.m., 2 seconds before the lockup. The signal origin is masked, but the command pathway leads back to a receiver that's not part of the factory build. Someone installed a secondary input device inside the vehicle. The room felt slightly smaller than it had when she'd walked in. "When?" she said. "Not during my watch," he said, and there was something quiet and absolute in that. Not defensive bravado, certainty. "Then who?" He opened his mouth to answer, and that was when the lights went out. Not a gradual dimming, not a flicker, a complete instantaneous loss of power throughout the facility. Every overhead light, every workstation monitor, every status LED on the server racks, all of it simply gone in the same fraction of a second, leaving behind a dark so total it felt almost physical. "Don't move," Ethan said. His voice had changed, not louder, not sharper. Flatter. All the inflection drained out of it in a way that Vivian would think about later, like a dial being turned from one setting to another. "What's happening?" she said, and she was proud of the fact that her voice was level. "Someone cut external power. These are steel-reinforced walls. Facility like this should have secondary battery backup that kicks in within 8 seconds. She heard him stand. "We're at 6 seconds, and nothing's coming on." No, 8 seconds passed. 10, 15. Nothing. "Backup's been disabled," he said. Then, from somewhere in the facility, muffled by walls and distance, but unmistakable, came the sound of the main access doors being breached. Not a crash. A controlled, deliberate series of sounds that Vivian recognized from enough corporate security briefings to know what they meant. Someone coming in who knew what they were doing. "Harris," she started. "Stay here," Ethan said. "Don't open that door for anyone but me." "You can't just—" But she was talking to an empty room. She heard the soft click of the data room door closing. She stood in the dark for 30 seconds, which was long enough for every catastrophic scenario her mind was capable of generating to make at least one appearance. And then she sat back down and did the most controlled thing she could think of. She picked up her phone and tried to call Harris. The call connected. 3 rings, 4, 5. Harris picked up on the 6th ring. "Ms. Sterling," his voice was oddly measured, not urgent, not afraid. "Harris, someone's breached the facility. Where's your team?" "We're aware of the situation," he said. "I'd recommend you stay where you are." The phrasing stopped her cold. "Not we're handling it, not we're coming to you. I'd recommend you stay where you are." "Harris?" She kept her voice very quiet. "Are you inside the facility right now?" A pause that was exactly 1 beat too long. "We're coordinating external response," he said. She ended the call. Her hands were not entirely steady when she set the phone down. She was aware of that, and she noted it the way you note something that needs to be dealt with later, and she focused on the sound of the facility around her. The settling sounds, the distant movement, the fact that the access doors had gone quiet again. Somewhere out in that darkness, armed men were moving through a building she didn't know well. And the only person who'd stayed was someone she'd met 4 hours ago. Ethan Walker moved through the Meridian facility the way water finds a path, not by force, but by reading the landscape. He'd memorized the floor plan 3 days after taking the assignment. Not because anyone told him to, because he couldn't make himself not do it. 8 months in Bay 7, and he knew the placement of every support column, every emergency door, every maintenance corridor that didn't appear on the publicly circulated maps. He knew where the cameras were, where the dead zones were, and where a man could stand without being seen from 3 different angles simultaneously. That last piece of knowledge was something he'd acquired in a very different kind of building, in a very different country, doing a job he no longer talked about. He moved toward the sound of the breach by keeping to the wall, low and quiet, letting his eyes adjust. Enough ambient light leaked in from somewhere, a gap in the exterior cladding maybe, or the thermal bays, that the darkness wasn't total, just deep enough that his outlines dissolved. He counted the sounds. 3 distinct movement signatures, footsteps with slightly different weight distributions, slightly different rhythms. 3 men, minimum, probably 4. They were moving with professional discipline, which told him they'd been briefed on the layout, which told him the briefing had come from someone who had access to facility schematics. He already knew what that meant. He needed Vivian to know it too. First, neutralize the immediate threat, or at least delay it long enough to get her to a defensible position. He made his way to the emergency panel at the junction of corridors B and C, a red box that most people assumed was a fire suppression control, and never looked at again. It wasn't. It was the auxiliary network hub for the facility's secondary systems, ventilation overrides, emergency bulkheads, and the manual toggle for the security camera infrastructure. He didn't turn the cameras on. He did something more useful. He isolated the feeds and began routing them through the auxiliary channel to an external storage address that he'd quietly configured during his first month at the facility. During the same week he'd memorized the floor plan. His supervisor at the time had asked why he was setting up auxiliary routing. "Backup protocols," he'd said. His supervisor had nodded and moved on. The thing about working a security-adjacent role in a facility that handled sensitive prototypes was that the protocols you built quietly, in the background, were sometimes the only ones that survived. He rerouted the feeds, locked the command, and moved. The men, he confirmed 4 of them now, picking up the 4th's heat signature by the sound of his breathing as he cleared Bay 3, were doing a systematic search, not random, methodical. Grid pattern, staged, with 2 staying near the main corridor while 2 advanced. They were looking for someone specific, and they were confident they'd find them. Ethan thought about that confidence and where it came from, and felt something cold settle in the center of his chest. They knew who was in this building. They'd known before they came in. He doubled back through a maintenance corridor that smelled of hydraulic fluid and old rubber, moving past the utility racks and the secondary HVAC bypass until he reached the internal junction closest to the data room. He tapped twice on the door. Not a knock, more of a touch. And when it opened 3 inches, he was already talking. "I need you to come with me," he said, quietly. Vivian Sterling opened the door the rest of the way. She was standing in the dark with her phone in one hand and a fire extinguisher in the other, held at shoulder height, and for 1 second he saw, not panic, but pure, calibrated fury. The kind that comes when an extremely controlled person decides that if someone is coming through that door, something significant is going to happen to them. He noted that, filed it. "Where?" she said. "Maintenance level. There's a secondary corridor system that doesn't appear on the standard blueprints, the original construction specs from when this was an aerospace facility. It runs behind the main bays." "How do you know that?" "I'll explain while we move," he said. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to make a decision, not so long as to waste time, and then she set the extinguisher down and followed him into the dark. The maintenance corridors were low and narrow, the kind of spaces that existed for infrastructure rather than people. Pipes ran overhead, cabling ran along the walls at hip height. The floor was bare concrete, slightly uneven in places where the original foundation had shifted, and it was cold enough that Vivian could feel it through the soles of her shoes. Ethan moved ahead of her, one hand trailing along the left wall for orientation. He didn't use his phone's flashlight. She understood why, without being told, the light would show under the access doors. "Your security team," he said quietly. He didn't phrase it as a question. "They left," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, flat. "Or were already outside when this started." "I know." He slowed at a junction, tilted his head, listening, and then continued right. "They weren't here by accident. Harris has been with me for 2 years. I'm not saying he wasn't loyal to you for 2 years. I'm saying tonight he was loyal to someone else." She let that land and processed it at the same speed she processed quarterly earnings reports and board challenges and supplier renegotiations, meaning she didn't let herself feel it yet. That would come later, when she had the luxury of time and privacy. Right now she needed to think. "How many are in there?" she said. "4 that I've confirmed. Could be more holding position outside." He moved around something she couldn't see in the dark and held his arm back to guide her past it. "They're organized. They came with a plan." "What kind of plan?" He didn't answer immediately. They moved another 30 feet, turned left, and stopped at what felt like a wider section of corridor. There was more air here, less of the enclosed pressure of the narrow sections. "The device installed in the Meridian," he said. "The remote steering controller. That wasn't opportunistic. Someone installed it before the demonstration, knowing what the demonstration was, knowing who would be in the facility. The steering failure wasn't meant to destroy the car." He paused. "I think it was meant to demonstrate capability, show someone what they could do." "Who was it a demonstration for?" "That's what I was trying to figure out when the power went out." She was quiet for a moment, standing in the dark beside a man she'd spoken to twice, listening to the distant muffled sounds of armed men moving through her facility. There was something almost surreal about the quality of the silence in the maintenance corridor, the way it created a pocket of stillness that felt entirely disconnected from the events happening 20 feet away. "You were a Navy SEAL," she said. She felt rather than saw his reaction. A slight stillness. "What makes you say that?" he said. "The way you move. The way you talked when the lights went out." She paused. "And the fact that you've spent the last 20 minutes managing a tactical situation with the calm of someone who has been in considerably worse ones." Another silence. Longer this time. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Your personnel file doesn't mention it." "I know." She waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't, which told her something. Not that he was hiding it, something more specific. He'd known it was missing. "Someone removed it," she said. "I noticed it was gone about 3 months into this assignment." His voice was even, controlled. "I figured I'd leave it alone and see if anything else happened." "And has it?" "Just tonight," he said. There was a moment, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, crouched in the maintenance corridor with Ethan Walker while 4 armed men searched the facility above them, when Vivian Sterling's mind went very quiet. Not blank. Quiet. The particular silence that comes when every non-essential process shuts down and what remains is only the immediate problem. The immediate problem. Armed men, unknown intent toward her specifically, building locked down, external communication compromised. Her phone had signal, but she'd already learned that at least one person on the receiving end of that signal was part of the problem. She didn't know who else was. The only available resource was the man beside her, whose background contained a years-long gap that someone had deliberately created, which meant someone at Titan Apex had known, at some point, that Ethan Walker's real credentials were worth hiding. She turned that over while Ethan worked. What he was doing, quietly, efficiently, with what looked like absolute absence of doubt, was constructing a delay. He'd already described it in brief, practical terms as they moved. I'm going to give them something to chase that isn't us. He'd pulled what he needed from the maintenance supply racks as they passed, materials she recognized as standard facility equipment, but whose specific application in this context she wasn't immediately clear on. "Talk me through it," she said. "What are you doing?" "Thermal decoys," he said, not looking up from what he was assembling. "These older maintenance corridors have air handling vents that feed into the main HVAC system. If I route heat sources through specific vents at the right distribution points, the facility's emergency thermal sensors, which will be running on battery backup even if everything else is dark, will read them as heat signatures in locations we're not in. They'll follow the thermal signatures. For a while, long enough. How do you know they have thermal readers?" He looked up. "Because I would." She accepted this. "And the cameras you were rerouting, everything the cameras have captured tonight is already transmitting to an external address." He went back to what he was doing. "Whatever happens in this building, the footage survives outside of it." She looked at him for a moment in the dim light. There was slightly more ambient light in this section, enough to read shapes and expressions if not fine detail, and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not gratitude exactly. More like the particular clarity that comes when you understand that the person beside you is actually, genuinely, unreservedly on your side, not for reasons of policy or job description, but for reasons that were harder to articulate and considerably more durable. "Ethan," she said. Why did you stay?" He set down what he was working with and looked at her with an expression that was more complicated than she expected, not the flat tactical efficiency she'd been reading for the last hour. Something behind that, underneath the controlled surface, a person with a fully dimensional life that she was only seeing the edge of. "There was a choice," he said. "Everybody else made theirs." She waited to see if there was more. "I have a daughter," he said after a moment. 8 years old. She thinks I fix fast cars, which is not entirely inaccurate. A pause. "I'd rather she be able to look at the choice I made tonight and understand it." Vivian didn't say anything. Some things were better not wrapped in words. "Also," he added with a dryness that arrived completely without warning, "I've been 8 months on this project. I'd like to know what actually happened to the steering." She laughed, quietly, into her hand, in the dark of a maintenance corridor, while armed men moved through her facility above them. It was the kind of laugh that surprised the person doing the laughing, the involuntary kind. "So would I," she said. At approximately 9:45 p.m., Ethan executed the thermal diversion. He'd positioned 6 heat sources at calculated points throughout the maintenance network. Not uniform, because uniform would read as artificial. He'd varied the distribution, staggered the timing, oriented 2 of them to bleed through vents into areas where the intruders were already moving. On a thermal reader, the facility would now appear to contain multiple heat signatures in locations that didn't correspond to any of the actual people in the building. The effect was exactly what he'd intended. He could track the searchers' responses by listening to the sound patterns shift, the way the footsteps change direction, the way the team's communication clicks, 2 short, 1 long, a simple code, rerouted toward the false targets. He and Vivian moved in the opposite direction, toward the facility's northeast corner, where the auxiliary mechanical room backed against an exterior wall with a conduit access point large enough for a person to pass through. Not comfortably, but pass through. He was going to explain that before they got there. He was also going to explain what he'd found in the last 30 seconds on the laptop. The small, ruggedized unit he'd pulled from the emergency supply closet and connected briefly to the auxiliary network. What he'd found was this. The equipment that had sent the remote command to the Meridian steering controller carried a registration signature, a device ID embedded in the signal by the transmitter's firmware, the electronic equivalent of a license plate. and that device ID traced to an asset registered to Titan Apex Motors Corporate Security Division, equipment assigned specifically to the division's chief. He hadn't shown Vivian yet. He needed to think about how to show her, because what it meant was the kind of thing that rearranged everything a person thought they knew about their situation. The man whose job was to protect this company had opened the door for the people inside it, or more precisely, the man whose job was to protect Vivian Sterling had been the one pointing the gun. He kept them moving. The northeast mechanical room was 50 feet ahead through a junction that required crossing 6 feet of open corridor. He checked the thermal movement. The false signatures were still pulling attention south and west. Good. Almost there, he said. Ethan. Her voice was quiet but pointed. Yeah. You found something on the laptop. He glanced back at her. She was watching him with the same expression she'd had during the demonstration when the Meridian had locked up. Not panic, but that focused, measuring calm that seemed to be her baseline response to crisis. Processing. Calculating. I did, he said. The device that sent the signal to the Meridian steering controller, she said. You found where it's registered. He stopped. I saw your expression when you closed the laptop, she said. You found it, and it's bad. They were standing at the corridor junction, 6 feet of open space between them and the mechanical room. The facility around them was quiet in a way that felt like held breath. Yeah, he said. It's bad. Tell me. The device is registered to corporate security. He watched her face. Asset assigned to the CSO's division. She was very still for a moment. Not the stillness of shock. She'd seen something in Damian Cross's face tonight. He knew she had, because she was the kind of person who saw those things. But the stillness of confirmation, the particular weight of a suspicion becoming a fact. Damian, she said, not a question. That's where the registration leads, he said. She breathed out slowly through her nose. Okay, she said. What's the move? And that, more than anything else that had happened in the last 2 hours, was the moment Ethan Walker understood who Vivian Sterling actually was. Not the polished CEO he'd observed from a distance for 8 months. Not the controlled professional managing the fallout of a failed demonstration. The person underneath all of that, in the dark, with 4 armed men in the building and her own security chief apparently on the other end of the operation. Someone who, when given information that rearranged the world, immediately asked what came next. The move, he said, is through that junction into the mechanical room, and we wait for the thermal signatures to pull everyone to the wrong end of the building. Then I make a call to somebody outside. Who? Someone who doesn't work for this company, he said, and doesn't know Damian Cross. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Okay, she said again. They crossed the junction at a low run, slipped through the mechanical room door, and pulled it closed behind them. In the darkness beyond the closed door, the facility held its held breath a moment longer. Then the sounds shifted. The intruders moving, responding to the thermal signals, heading the wrong direction. And in the mechanical room, in the dark, Vivian Sterling sat against the wall with her knees pulled up and her phone in her hand, and Ethan Walker sat beside her and pulled out a phone that was registered to a name she didn't know yet, and dialed a number. He waited through 3 rings. It's Walker, he said when the call connected. His voice was different again, the flat, efficient register she'd heard when the lights first went out. I need extraction coordination on a restricted facility breach. 4 tangos confirmed inside. The principal is with me and she's okay. He paused, listening. I know it's been a long time. Another pause. That's why I'm calling you. He lowered the phone. Vivian looked at him in the dark. 20 minutes, he said. They'll coordinate with law enforcement from outside. And until then, we stay quiet, he said, and we don't open that door. She nodded, pulled her knees a little closer. Outside, somewhere in the facility, the intruders were chasing shadows. Inside the mechanical room, 2 people who'd been strangers 6 hours ago sat in the dark and waited for the world to catch up to what had already happened. Vivian Sterling had walked into this facility tonight thinking the biggest thing she had to manage was a failed demonstration. She'd been wrong about that.
She'd been wrong about Harris. She'd been wrong about how safe she was inside her own company. But she was alive. The evidence was transmitting to a server Damian Cross didn't know existed, and the man sitting beside her had made his choice without being asked. That would have to be enough. For now, that was going to have to be enough. The 20 minutes Ethan had promised stretched into 32. Vivian counted them. Not because she was panicking. She'd moved past that particular option somewhere around the 15-minute mark, but because counting gave her something to do with the part of her mind that wasn't occupied with processing everything she'd learned in the last 2 hours. The device registration, Damian's division, the fact that Harris had picked up his phone during an active breach and spoken to her with the measured tone of a man who already knew exactly where she was and had decided not to be troubled by it. She was sitting against the mechanical room wall with her back to a conduit junction that pressed a cold metal edge into her shoulder blade. She hadn't moved. Ethan was 3 feet to her left, also on the floor, the ruggedized laptop open at a low angle on his knee with the screen brightness turned all the way down. He'd been working in near silence for the better part of 20 minutes, and she'd learned quickly that interrupting whatever he was doing was approximately as productive as interrupting a surgeon mid-procedure. So she counted, and she thought. The thing about the device registration, the thing she kept returning to, was not the fact of Damian's involvement. That she could absorb. What she kept turning over was the timing of it. The steering lockup had happened at 4:17 p.m. The command had been sent precisely 2 seconds before impact, which meant someone had been watching the demonstration in real time, watching Castellano approach the hairpin at 72 miles per hour, and had chosen that exact moment to execute. Not to crash the car. That would have been simple enough. Hold the lock for another 2 seconds, and the Meridian hits the barrier at speed and Castellano doesn't walk away. But they'd held it just long enough to stop the car. To demonstrate. Ethan had said that. She'd filed it away, and now it was resurfacing with weight attached to it. Someone had wanted her to know the car could be controlled remotely. Wanted her to see it fail, publicly, in front of 7 executives. Wanted her rattled and her project compromised, but not catastrophically, not yet, because the catastrophic part came later, tonight, and required her to be alive and present for it. The picture that assembled itself out of those pieces was both cleaner and more nauseating than what she'd initially imagined. "Ethan," she said quietly. "Yeah." He didn't look up. "The demonstration failure this afternoon, it wasn't meant to destroy the project." "No," he said. "It was leverage. They needed something to hold over the company, evidence that the flagship vehicle was compromised, so that when the rest of tonight played out, there'd already be doubt established, already be cracks in the foundation." He looked up then. In the low light from the laptop screen, his face was difficult to read, but she caught the slight shift in his expression, the recognition that she'd arrived at the same place he had, independently. "That's what I think," he said. "They were going to blame you for the steering failure too, weren't they?" She said it flat. Not a question. A pause. "The manipulated personnel records help with that. Man with a secret military history inserted into the prototype team, access to the vehicle for 8 months. He said it without particular emotion, like he was reading a file on someone else. Makes a reasonable story. How long have you known that was the plan?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the mechanical room door, the facility had gone very still. The intruders had been pulled toward the far end of the building by the thermal decoys and had apparently been disciplined enough not to immediately backtrack. The stillness wouldn't last. "I didn't know the whole plan," he said, "but I knew someone had gone to the trouble of removing 8 years of my service record from a company database, and that the only people with access to that database worked in HR, IT, or executive administration. And I knew the prototype had been accessed during my off hours 3 separate times in the last 6 weeks. I found the access logs, didn't say anything yet because I didn't have the full picture." Vivian stared at him. "You found evidence of unauthorized access to the Meridian and didn't report it?" "I reported it to my direct supervisor," he said. "Twice. In writing." The air in the room changed slightly. "Nothing happened," she said. "My supervisor works under the head of the prototype division," he said carefully, "who reports to the board chairman." He held her gaze. "I was watching to see what would happen next.
She absorbed this. You were building your own case. I was waiting to see whose side the information would disappear on. He closed the laptop halfway. It disappeared. She understood then, not just the mechanics of what had happened, but the particular loneliness of it. 8 months of watching a conspiracy assemble itself around a machine he'd been assigned to protect, knowing the channels that should have been trustworthy weren't, not being able to move without exposing whatever advantage he'd been quietly accumulating. She thought about what that must have felt like for a man with an 8-year-old daughter waiting at home, sitting on information that made him a target in a building full of people who were either complicit or oblivious. She wanted to say something about that. She didn't have the right words, and this wasn't the time. What's on the laptop right now? She said. I'm trying to get into the Meridian's data recorder remotely through the auxiliary network. He reopened the screen all the way, angling it so she could see. The physical recorder is in the vehicle in Bay 7, but the recorder mirrors to a secondary cache on the facility's internal server, which I can access from here if I can authenticate through the maintenance console. He typed something. Waited. Typed again. The mirror cache should have everything. Command logs, input histories, every signal the vehicle received or transmitted in the last 72 hours. And if you can pull that data, then we have the full signal trail. Origin, pathway, command structure, timing. He paused, watching the screen. It's better than the device registration alone. The registration is circumstantial. Someone could claim the device was stolen, cloned, whatever. But the full command log shows the operational fingerprint, how the signal was structured. That's not easy to fake, and it's not easy to explain away. Something in the server rack to Vivian's right made a soft electronic click, and they both went still for 2 seconds. The click didn't repeat. A relay cycling, probably. The facility running on whatever auxiliary power remained. How much battery does this building have? She said. Emergency battery backup runs critical systems for about 4 hours. We're past the 90-minute mark, which means if someone has been drawing on it deliberately, running searches, moving the environmental systems, we might have less. He scrolled through something on the screen. The thermal decoys I set up are drawing power too. I tried to minimize it, but we have maybe 2 hours, she said. Maybe less. She nodded, pulled her phone out and looked at the screen. No new calls, no messages from anyone at the company. Either everyone was home and unaware, or everyone who knew was already on the wrong side of this. She opened her contacts and looked at a name she hadn't dialed in 4 months. Marcus Hale, her predecessor. The man who'd handed her the keys to Titan Apex and then retired to a house on the Oregon coast, reportedly to sail and read books and stop caring about corporate politics. She'd called him twice since taking the role. Once when a supplier crisis nearly derailed Q2, once when a board challenge looked like it might actually succeed. Both times he'd listened, said very little, and the advice he'd eventually offered had been more useful than anything she'd gotten from anyone closer to the situation. She didn't know if he was clean. She didn't know if he was connected to whatever Damien Cross had been building. But she knew 3 things. Marcus Hale had hired Damien, Marcus Hale had hired Ethan, and Marcus Hale had, according to every piece of financial and governance history she'd ever reviewed, been scrupulously careful about keeping the company out of exactly this kind of internal corruption. She couldn't be sure. Tonight, certainty was a resource in very short supply. She didn't dial. She put the phone away and watched Ethan work. After another few minutes, he exhaled. Not with relief, with something more complicated. Got it. She leaned in. The screen showed a cascading log of data. Timestamps, command strings, signal headers. And even without the technical background to parse every line, she could see the structure. A clean sequential record of everything the Meridian had received and transmitted. The remote command at 417, he said, scrolling to a highlighted section. Here's the full signal. Origin is masked. They routed it through a relay, but the relay leaves its own signature. He zoomed in. This relay signature matches the relay equipment standard in Titan Apex's corporate security mobile operations kit, the same kit that goes out with the CSO's team when they do field deployments. Damien's equipment, she said, his divisions, specific to the field kit. He pulled up a second window, a specifications document, something he'd accessed from the facility's internal document server. He scrolled to a page showing equipment inventory. The mobile relay is listed here as an asset issued to the Security Division's tactical team. Access to that equipment requires CSO-level authorization. She was very still for a moment. He didn't just allow this to happen, she said. He ran the operation. The signal architecture says yes. He closed both windows and started a file transfer, the full data cache moving to the same external server address where the camera feeds were already transmitting. How long that inference holds up under a legal review depends on what else we can connect it to. But as a starting point, he stopped. Both of them heard it at the same time. Not the soft facility sounds they'd been calibrating to for the last 30 minutes. Something specific. A voice. Close. Not outside the mechanical room door, but on the other side of the wall behind them, in the corridor that ran adjacent. Vivian pressed back against the wall instinctively, though she was already against it. Ethan closed the laptop in one motion, darkness absorbing them both. The voice came again. Low, male, with the economical phrasing of someone communicating operationally rather than conversationally. South quadrant is clear. False positives on thermal. Somebody's running decoys. A pause. Regroup at Bay 5. He's in the building somewhere. She noticed. He, not they. Not the principal and her protector or whatever operational language these people were using for her. Just he. They were looking for Ethan. She turned her head in the darkness and found his face by approximate position. She couldn't see his expression clearly, but she could feel the quality of his attention, absolutely concentrated on the voice on the other side of the wall, extracting every available data point from it. The footsteps receded. South, toward Bay 5. They know who you are, she breathed, not louder than a breath. Yeah, he said, same volume. They came here for you. A pause. They came here to establish a specific story, he said. The steering failure is already in the record. That's Act 1. Tonight is Act 2. Armed intruders breach a restricted facility, there's a confrontation, the CEO is found in a compromised position, and the only man left standing at the scene with military training and a secret history is the one the evidence points at. He was quiet for a second. It's a clean frame. If it works, I'm the story. The steering sabotage, the breach, whatever happens to you tonight, all of it traces back to the mechanic with the hidden background who had 8 months of access to the vehicle. She felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly. Fury, maybe, at the precision of it, how carefully it had been constructed, how many people had to have been involved, how long it must have taken. Damien's been planning this for a long time, she said. Long enough to remove my records, Ethan said. Long enough to establish the cover story before the night happened. What does he actually want? That, Ethan said, is what we don't have yet. She thought for a moment. The voice outside had said Bay 5. That put the intruders in the northwest section, away from the northeast mechanical room, but heading toward a convergence point. The thermal decoys wouldn't hold them much longer. They'd already identified the false positives. Whoever was coordinating outside the building, Damien, presumably, monitoring from somewhere with a clear sight line to the operation, would redirect them soon. We need to move again, she said. In a minute. Ethan opened the laptop. File transfer's still running. I need it to complete. How long? He checked. 4 minutes. Maybe 3.5. She pressed her lips together. Okay? 3.5 minutes in complete silence, listening to the facility around them reorganize itself. She heard the team at Bay 5, muffled communication, footsteps stopping and starting. She heard something that might have been a door. She heard her own heartbeat, which she would have preferred not to. At the 2-minute mark, her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. Not a call. A text message. From Damien Cross. She read it once. Then again. Vivian. I know this has been a frightening night. I want you to know there's still a path through this that doesn't require anyone to get hurt. We should talk. She showed it to Ethan. He read it in the dark by tilting the screen. His expression didn't change much, but she caught something in it. A particular kind of recognition, like seeing a tactic he'd encountered before in a different context. He doesn't know where we are, he said quietly. If he knew, he wouldn't be texting. He'd be sending them here. He's trying to open a channel, she said.
He wants you scared enough to negotiate. His eyes came back to hers. Don't respond yet. I wasn't going to. He almost smiled, not quite. I know. The file transfer completed at the 3-minute 20 mark. Ethan confirmed the external receipt, closed the transfer window, and shut the laptop. Everything, she said. Everything the cache had. He tucked the laptop under his arm. Camera feeds, command logs, signal records. All of it is outside this building now. She let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for some time. Okay. She stood. Her knees had stiffened from the cold floor. She didn't let herself show that. The conduit access. You said northeast wall. 8 feet from here, he said, also standing. It's a tight fit. Construction access from the original build. Leads to an exterior service area on the north face of the building. There's a utility corridor from there to the secondary gate on the perimeter fence. He paused. It won't be comfortable. I went to college on a partial scholarship, she said. I've been uncomfortable before. He did something with his expression that might, under better lighting conditions, have been amusement. Then he moved to the northeast wall and found what he was looking for by touch. A panel, flush-mounted, that came free with the specific pressure of someone who knew which corner to push. Behind it was a conduit access passage, roughly 2 feet wide, with cables and pipes running along both walls. Dark, low, smelling of dust and old insulation. She looked at it. You first, she said. Better if I go second, he said. Cover the rear. She looked at him for a second. He was right and she knew it, which didn't make the prospect of going first into a dark tunnel with armed men somewhere behind her feel appreciably better. She went first. The passage was everything he'd described and less pleasant than that description had suggested. She moved on her hands and knees because there wasn't clearance to do otherwise, and the floor was rough concrete with a thin layer of grit that found its way immediately into her palms. The cables on the wall weren't secured tightly, and one of them caught her shoulder. She moved carefully, not fast, feeling ahead of herself with each reach. Behind her, she could hear Ethan moving, quieter than she expected from someone his size, though she was starting to recalibrate her expectations of him across the board. 12 feet of crawl space. Then another 8. Then the passage opened slightly and angled downward for 2 or 3 feet, and she felt the change in air before she saw the end. Fresher, cooler, carrying the smell of the outside. A grill, bolted from the inside, which she held for Ethan to deal with because it required a tool she didn't have. He came up beside her in the tight space, produced something from his jacket pocket that she didn't try to identify, and had the grill off in 30 seconds. Cool night air flooded in. They were out. The north face of the Meridian facility was a flat expanse of concrete service apron, lit by a single pole light at the far end that threw everything in long, angular shadows. No visible movement. The perimeter fence was 140 feet ahead, and the secondary gate was, she looked left, maybe 50 feet from their position. Gates locked? She said. Coded keypad. My access should still work unless they pulled credentials. He moved toward it, staying close to the building face where the shadow was deepest. She followed, moving the same way. 40 feet. 30. Her phone vibrated again. She silenced it without looking. Ethan reached the keypad. He tapped in the code without hesitating. 8 digits from memory, which she noted. And the gate gave a soft metallic click and opened inward 3 inches. They went through. On the other side of the fence, in the dark scrubland that surrounded the facility, the world felt abruptly larger. She hadn't realized how much the building had been pressing in on her until it wasn't. She could see the access road 200 feet to her right. No vehicles visible, but that didn't mean nothing was out there. The people he called, she said, keeping her voice low. The ones coordinating outside. How far out are they? Ethan checked his phone. 12 minutes ago, they were 8 miles out. Sheriff's units with a federal liaison. He paused. The federal contact is someone I trust. She registered that without asking the obvious follow-up. How and from where, and what exactly his relationship with federal contacts was. Because this was not the time, and she was self-aware enough to know that some answers would require a very different kind of conversation than the one they were currently having. 12 minutes ago, she said instead. So, close, he said. They moved along the fence line, away from the facility's main gate, and toward a position where the access road was visible in both directions. The ground was uneven. Scrubland didn't have any particular interest in being navigable, and she caught her ankle on something twice, the second time badly enough that she went down on one knee. She was up before Ethan could reach back for her. "I'm fine," she said, because she was, or close enough. He nodded, kept moving. She pulled out her phone as she walked. The text from Damien was still the last message. She looked at it again, a path through this that doesn't require anyone to get hurt. And this time the words arranged themselves differently in her mind, not as an appeal, as information. He was worried. The operation was running, but something wasn't going according to the script. And Damien Cross was reaching out because reaching out was what people did when the plan was starting to slip. She typed a reply, 5 words. "What do you actually want?" Ethan glanced at her phone as she sent it. She caught his look. "You said not to respond yet," she said. "I said yet," he said. "We're outside. The evidence is transmitted. Let him talk." She kept walking. "I want to know what he thinks he's getting out of this." 40 seconds later, the response came. She read it, stopped walking, and stood in the dark scrubland with the facility lights visible behind the fence and the access road 30 feet ahead. Ethan stopped beside her. She held out the phone. The message read, "Control of the company, Vivian. The real kind. Not the kind they handed to you because Marcus thought you were ready. You can resign voluntarily and retain your equity stake and your reputation. Or the footage from tonight tells a different story, one that ends your career and puts a man with a sealed military record in front of a federal jury. Your choice. You have 20 minutes." She took the phone back, read it once more. "The real kind," she said, "not the kind they handed to you." Ethan said nothing. "He thinks I'm here because Marcus gave me the company," she said. "He doesn't think I earned it." She looked up. The night sky above the scrubland was very clear. The kind of clear that only happened this far from city light. He's had 9 years to build something at Titan Apex, and he built a coup instead of a career, because somewhere along the way, he decided the company was being run by people who didn't deserve it. "Does that change anything?" Ethan said. Not provocatively, he was genuinely asking. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "No," she said. "But it explains why he was sloppy." She pocketed the phone. "Angry people rush." In the distance, on the access road, 2 sets of headlights appeared around the long curve that led toward the facility entrance, moving fast, but not sirens and chaos fast. Controlled. Deliberate. Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked it. "That's them." She looked at the approaching vehicles. Sheriff's vehicles. 2 of them, and behind them a third car. Darker, no visible markings. She stood in the scrubland outside her own facility on a cool night with grit on her palms and a torn hem on her jacket that she hadn't noticed until right now. And she watched the lights come closer, and she felt something she hadn't felt in the last 3 hours for the first time. The specific sensation of a situation beginning to turn. Not over. Not even close to over. Damien was still inside or somewhere nearby. The men inside the facility were still armed, and whatever evidence his team had spent the last several hours manufacturing was still out there waiting to be deployed. The board meeting that was coming, the legal process, the corporate fallout, all of that was on the horizon, large and complicated and uncertain. But the evidence was out. The recordings were safe, and beside her stood a man who had stayed when everyone else left and had made every decision since then as if the outcome mattered to him personally, not because it was his job. She thought about his daughter, 8 years old, thinking her father fixed fast cars. She was going to make sure that girl knew exactly what her father had actually done tonight. Not the military record that someone had tried to erase, not the Navy SEAL history that someone had decided made him dangerous. The choice he'd made at 8:07 p.m. in a darkened data room when the available options were leave or stay, and he'd stayed. The headlights stopped at the main gate. Doors opened. Voices, controlled, professional, cutting through the night air with the specific authority of people who had the legal weight to back it up. "Walker," a male voice. "Federal agent, talk to me." Ethan cupped his hands around his mouth. "North fence line, 2 of us. Principal is unharmed." A pause. Then, "Coming to you."
Vivian looked at Ethan in the near darkness. He was watching the approaching figures, reading them the same way he'd been reading everything tonight. Not with suspicion, exactly, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had learned not to stop paying attention just because things looked like they were going the right direction. "When they take you in," she said, "and they will because the records—" "I know," he said. "I'll be right behind you." He glanced at her. "Ms. Sterling." "Vivian," she said. She'd lost track of when that shift had happened or whether she'd consciously decided it. "And I mean it. Whatever story Damien's footage tries to tell, I'm going to be standing in the room saying exactly what happened tonight." She paused. "You protected me. You protected the evidence. You stayed." She held his gaze. "That's the story." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. "My daughter's going to be at school tomorrow morning wondering where I am," he said. She pulled out her phone. "Tell me her name and who she stays with when you're away." "Riley," he said, with a slight change in his voice that she'd remember later. The involuntary softening that happened when someone said something that genuinely mattered to them. "She's with my neighbor, Mrs. Calder." Vivian typed it. "I'll make sure someone contacts Mrs. Calder tonight." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Something in it was surprised, though he tried not to show that. As if he'd spent so much time being the person who made sure other people were taken care of, that being on the receiving end of it required a brief recalibration. "Thank you," he said. The federal agents reached the fence line. Flashlights swept across them, not aggressively, but with the thoroughness of people confirming what they'd been told to expect. Ethan Walker. A woman this time. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, the kind of controlled competence that came from doing a difficult job for a long time. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I'm Agent Carver. I know your contact." She looked at Vivian. "Ms. Sterling, you all right?" "I'm fine," Vivian said. "We have 4 armed intruders inside the facility and evidence of a coordinated internal conspiracy that originated from the company's security division." She said it the way she'd have said it in a board meeting. Complete, sequential, without vocal decoration. "I'll give you the full debrief, but I want to be clear about something before we go any further." She held Carver's gaze. "This man saved my life tonight, and whatever story you've been told that suggests otherwise needs to be corrected immediately." Carver looked at her for a moment, then at Ethan, then back. "All right," she said, in a tone that was professionally neutral but not dismissive. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" Behind them, inside the Meridian facility, lights had come back on. The law enforcement vehicles had restored external power, or something had been reconnected at the mains. Through the fence, through the facility's high windows, Vivian could see the building illuminated again for the first time since the breach. The same building she'd walked into 8 hours ago, thinking the most complicated thing about the night would be managing the fallout of a failed vehicle demonstration. It looked different now, smaller somehow. Or maybe she was just standing outside it for the first time, looking at it from the other side of everything that had happened inside it. She turned to Agent Carver. "The beginning," she said, "was a steering failure at 4:17 this afternoon, and it wasn't an accident." Agent Carver was a good listener. That was the first thing Vivian noticed about her. Not the badge, not the sidearm, not the way she directed her team with small economical gestures while keeping her attention on the person in front of her. The listening. She had the particular quality of someone who had trained herself to absorb information without visibly reacting to it, which meant that when she did react, it landed differently, more weighted. She listened to Vivian's account of the night without interrupting. 43 minutes, standing in a portable light cluster that one of the sheriff's deputies had set up near the north gate, with the facility blazing behind them, and 2 ambulance units parked at the main entrance even though nobody needed them yet. She listened to the steering failure, the power cut, Harris's phone call, the maintenance corridors, the thermal decoys, the device registration, the command log, the file transfer to the external server. She listened to all of it, and she took notes on a small pad with a pen that was almost out of ink. She switched to a backup pen at the 20-minute mark without breaking eye contact. And when Vivian was done, she looked at Ethan Walker for about 4 seconds. "The external server address," she said to him. "I need it." "You'll have it," he said, "after I've confirmed you're who Walker said you are." Carver didn't blink. which means you checked while she was talking. My phone's been in my pocket for 20 minutes, he said. I checked before we came to the fence. She almost smiled. Not quite. The contact we have in common is going to find that either reassuring or annoying. Probably both, Ethan said. He usually does. Vivian watched this exchange with the slightly removed attention of someone running on adrenaline residue and very little else, and she recognized that Ethan Walker's network of contacts was going to require a separate conversation at a time when her brain was capable of properly registering what it was being told. What she was capable of registering right now: 4 of Damien's men had been taken into custody inside the facility in the 20 minutes since law enforcement arrived, secured without incident because they'd been caught effectively mid-search, still operating on the assumption that their targets were somewhere inside and hadn't yet calculated that the situation had changed. The 5th man, the one whose voice they'd heard through the mechanical room wall, had apparently exited through the main bay doors before law enforcement sealed them and was currently somewhere Carver's people were working to locate. And Damien Cross himself was not on site. That was the part that sat uneasily in Vivian's chest as she watched Carver's team work the scene. She'd texted him from the scrubland. He'd responded, which meant he'd been watching, monitoring the operation from somewhere with communication access, close enough to feel real-time oversight, far enough to maintain deniability if the operation collapsed. He was smart. She'd always known he was smart. She'd just made the fairly significant error of assuming that smart and loyal were related. She was standing near the facility entrance when her phone rang. Not a text this time. A call. Damien's name on the screen. She looked at it for 3 rings. Then she looked at Carver, who was 6 feet away and had seen the screen. Answer it, Carver said immediately. Keep him talking. She was already gesturing to one of her people, who moved in with a device Vivian didn't have a technical name for but understood the purpose of. Vivian answered. Vivian. His voice was the same as always, measured, authoritative, slightly warmer than the professional register required. The voice she'd heard in 100 meetings. The voice she'd trusted, not enthusiastically, but adequately, which was apparently how he'd preferred it. I'm glad you're all right. Are you? She said. It came out flatter than she intended, which was probably fine. I want to be clear that tonight was never meant to put you in physical danger. That wasn't the plan. She looked at Carver, who gave a small nod. Keep going. What was the plan, Damien? A pause, brief, controlled. He was managing this the way he managed everything, she realized, which was with the professional discipline of a man who had been in security for 30 years and had built his entire identity around the appearance of being in control of the situation. Even now, even here. The plan was a transition, he said. Clean, fast, minimal collateral. You'd have retained your equity, your reputation, everything financial. The board was going to move in a different direction with leadership. That was already decided. And tonight was about ensuring the transition happened on a defined timeline rather than a drawn-out boardroom fight. The board, she said. Which members? That's a conversation for a different... Which members, Damien? Another pause. Longer. You're recording this, he said. Is there a reason I shouldn't be? The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long, which was the longest she'd ever heard Damien Cross be silent when he had a reason not to be. She could hear something in the background, ambient sound, traffic possibly, which told her he was in a vehicle, moving. The chairman, he said finally, and several members of the senior executive committee. They've had concerns about the direction of the company for some time. The Meridian project was sabotaged by your division's equipment, she said. We have the command logs. The silence this time was different, not calculated, genuinely empty, in the way that happens when someone's mental framework encounters something it hadn't built a response to yet. I need you to understand something, he said, and for the first time the control in his voice had a crack running through it, something almost desperate underneath the professional surface. I've been at Titan Apex for 9 years. 9 years of building something. Marcus brought me in, and I gave that company everything, and then Marcus handed it to you, and nobody asked me. Nobody asked anyone who'd actually been there so whether the company was going in the right direction. Vivian didn't say anything. Let him continue. You're good at this, Vivian. I'm not saying you're not. You're smart and you're capable, and you've made some good decisions. But you're 30 years old and you've been CEO for 3 years. And the people who've been here since the beginning, who built the foundation you're standing on, they got nothing. No consultation, no transition, just a handover and a press release and 6 months of watching you rewrite things that worked. She heard it. Not just the words. The years underneath the words. The specific weight of someone who had decided they'd been overlooked for the last time, and who had rationalized everything that followed from that decision into a kind of justice. "Damien," she said, "you built a coup. I built a corrective. You put armed men in a building with me in it. They were there to secure the facility and ensure you didn't—" He stopped, started again. "The operational team was not authorized to—" "Don't!" Her voice came out sharp enough that Carver looked at her. She softened it, barely. "Do not tell me what they were or weren't authorized to do when we both know that 4 of those men are in custody right now, and one of them is still out there somewhere. Don't give me the management version of tonight. Tell me the actual version." A long silence. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice. Not confession, exactly. Not regret. Something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just had it taken away from them without the relief they expected. "The 5th man," he said. "His name is Reyes. He's ex-private security. He's going to try to reach the data room. He's been briefed on the auxiliary server, and he has credentials to access the recorder cache." She was already looking at Carver. "The evidence, already off-site," Ethan said from 2 feet behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. He had his own phone to his ear, and he was looking at her with an expression that was calm and specific. "He's not going to find anything in that room." Carver was already on her radio. Vivian turned back to her phone. "The evidence is already gone, Damien. The camera feeds, the command logs, the signal records, all of it transmitted off-site before law enforcement arrived. Whatever story you were planning to tell with the surveillance footage, it's been replaced by the real one." The silence that came after that was the longest yet. "Where are you?" she said. He didn't answer that. "You have people in custody who are going to tell a very detailed story about tonight," she said, "because that is what people in custody do when offered the alternative. You have financial records that presumably show payment structures that federal investigators are going to find interesting. You have a device registration that connects your division's equipment to sabotage of a company vehicle." She was keeping her voice level. She had the feeling that the moment she let anger into it, the conversation would shift in a direction that didn't serve anyone. "And now you have a recorded call in which you've confirmed the board chairman's involvement and described the operational plan for tonight." Another silence. Shorter. "I want to speak with an attorney," he said. "Then you should go somewhere that has one," she said, "and let Agent Carver's people know where that is. Because the alternative is a manhunt, and I don't think that's how you want this to end." She ended the call. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed that. She pressed them flat against her thighs for 3 seconds and then let them go and turned to face Carver. "He's in a vehicle," she said, moving, the background noise. "We've already triangulated from the call metadata," Carver said, and there was a brief quiet satisfaction in that sentence that Vivian appreciated on a purely functional level. "Team is en route." "He gave up the 5th man," Ethan said. He was watching Vivian with the particular attention she'd been on the receiving end of all night. Not surveillance, something more deliberate. Assessing. "Reyes, why?" "He's calculating," Vivian said. "He gave us Reyes to buy himself something. Cooperation credit, maybe, or just time to think." She paused. "He's not going to run. That's not who he is. He's going to manage this the way he's managed everything. Find the version of the situation that he can present as something other than what it was." "You know him," Ethan said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "I've worked with him for 3 years," she said. "I knew his professional self very well. I apparently didn't know him at all." She looked toward the facility where Carver's team and the sheriff's units were moving in and out of the main entrance in a steady flow. The board chairman, Arthur Voss. She said the name the way you say something you've been turning over and finally have to set down out loud. Arthur Voss had been chairman of Titan Apex's board for 11 years.
He was 64, patrician in the specific way of people who'd inherited money and then spent a lifetime augmenting it with connections. He'd been a consistent presence in her tenure, formal, occasionally condescending, but never actively hostile. She'd attributed his occasional friction to the same generational skepticism she'd encountered everywhere. A 30-year-old woman running a company that old men thought they understood better by virtue of having been alive longer. She hadn't attributed it to a coordinated plan to remove her. She should have, maybe. Or maybe she'd chosen not to, because that particular lens, everything is a threat, everyone is maneuvering, was one she'd consciously refused to adopt because it made it impossible to actually run anything. You couldn't build something while spending every resource looking for the knife at your back. Except sometimes there was a knife at your back. Sterling, Carver's voice. She'd stepped away to take a radio call and was now returning with a slightly altered expression. Not alarmed, but sharper, more specific. My team just reached the data room. She paused. The fifth man, Reyes, he was already there. He didn't find the transfer records, like Walker said, but he had a secondary device with him, a drive. He was attempting to upload falsified command logs to the facility server, plant evidence that would overwrite timestamps in the original records. Vivian absorbed this. Would it have worked? Probably not, Carver said. The original records are already off-site and timestamped with verified external server reception, but it would have created a parallel data set that a defense attorney could use to introduce doubt. How far did he get? He was interrupted, Carver said. He's in custody. Vivian nodded. Something in her chest loosened very slightly. One of those subtle releases of tension that you only notice when it's gone, because you'd spent so long holding it that it had become the baseline. Was anyone hurt? No, Carver said. She nodded again. Okay. She looked toward Ethan. He was standing slightly apart from the main cluster of activity, in the way she'd noticed him doing all night. Not removing himself, just preferring the edge of the group to the center of it. He was looking at his phone with an expression she recognized, the face of a parent calculating timing. Riley, she said. He looked up. Go call Mrs. Calder. Make sure your daughter knows you're all right before anything else gets complicated. He held her gaze for a moment. I need to stay until... Ethan. She said it quietly, firmly. The evidence is off-site. Law enforcement has the scene. You've answered the primary questions Agent Carver needed answered, and the rest can wait 20 minutes. She paused. Go call your daughter. He didn't argue with that, which suggested that whatever discipline he was applying to stay present and operational had been running fairly close to its limits. He walked toward the perimeter fence, a little way from the lights and the radios, and she watched him pull out his phone and dial. She turned back to Carver. What happens next, procedurally? We secure the scene, process the individuals in custody, begin coordinating with our financial crimes division on the payment records you described. Carver looked at her steadily. You're going to need to come in for a formal statement, tomorrow morning, ideally. Tonight you've given me the working outline, which is enough to move on the immediate situation, but we'll need everything formally documented. I'll be there at 7, Vivian said. 8 is fine. 7, she said again. She wanted this moving as fast as it could move. Carver looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite a smile. 7, she agreed. What came next on the next 90 minutes was the specific procedural chaos of a situation that had moved faster than the systems designed to process it. More law enforcement arrived. The county sheriff's office had jurisdiction questions with the federal unit that got resolved with the particular strained professionalism of agencies that work together regularly enough to have developed functional templates for their disagreements. The 4 men in custody were transported. A forensic team arrived for the facility itself, the mechanical room, the data room, Bay 7 where the Meridian sat at its slightly crooked angle from the afternoon. Evidence markers appeared in places Vivian had been standing an hour ago. She gave the same account 4 separate times to 4 separate people, each version slightly more formal than the last. She called her company's general counsel at 10:45 p.m. and had the particular experience of watching a lawyer's voice shift from sleep-rough to fully alert in approximately 30 seconds as he processed what she was telling him. She called her head of communications and gave a 12-sentence brief.
She did not call the board yet. That would require a different kind of preparation. Ethan came back from the fence line at approximately 11:15, and she could tell from the slight change in his posture, something released, something quieter, that the call had gone the way he'd needed it to. "She okay?" Vivian said. "Asleep," he said. "Mrs. Calder had told her I was working late on something important." He paused. "I didn't correct that exactly." "That's accurate enough," Vivian said. He almost did the thing that wasn't quite a smile again. She was developing a clearer picture of his range of expressions. They were considerably more specific than they appeared from a distance. Carver returned at 11:30 with an update and a request. "The device Reyes was carrying," she said to both of them. "The falsified command logs he was trying to upload. Our technical team has pulled the file structure and the authorship metadata." She paused. The files were created on a workstation registered to Titan Apex's security division, not field equipment, an internal machine, which means someone with physical access to the security division's office space prepared that evidence plant before the operation began. "They had a plan B from the start," Ethan said. "Standard contingency," Carver said. "If the primary evidence trail pointed too clearly at the security division, the falsified logs would introduce an alternative explanation." She looked at Vivian. "The workstation registration is going to help us trace who created the files, but it's going to require cooperation from your company's IT infrastructure." "You'll have everything IT has," Vivian said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll personally authorize full system access." She paused. "Tonight, if necessary." "Tomorrow is fine," Carver said. "The workstation's already been flagged. It's not going anywhere." She made a note. "One more thing. The board chairman, Arthur Voss. You said Cross named him in the call." "He did?" "We're going to need to move carefully on that," Carver said. "A sitting board chairman, so the political and legal architecture around that is going to take a minute to navigate." "How long is a minute?" Vivian said. Carver looked at her evenly. "Not long," she said, "but longer than tonight." Vivian accepted this because she had to, and because the part of her that was still a pragmatic person who understood systems acknowledged that Carver was right. You didn't walk up to a board chairman of an established automotive company with a criminal allegation and expect the process to be fast. You built it properly, because built properly was the only way it survived what was coming. She was standing near the main entrance at midnight, watching the forensic team work through Bay 7's windows, when Ethan came and stood beside her. They were both quiet for a moment, watching the lights move inside the facility where, 8 hours ago, they'd been strangers in the same room for the first time. "Your personnel file," she said eventually. "D. Someone in this company deliberately removed your military record from the database." She looked at him. "Why? If the plan was to frame you tonight, a visible military record would have made the frame stronger, more threatening. Why erase it?" He was quiet for a moment. She had the sense he'd been thinking about this for a while. "The record makes me harder to dismiss," he said. "If my file shows Navy SEAL, that's a flag. People ask questions. Someone thinks, why is a SEAL working as a prototype mechanic, and who knows about it, and who authorized the hire?" He paused. "But if my file shows a straightforward mechanical background, I'm invisible. Just a technician. No one looks twice." "They kept you invisible so they could access the vehicle without scrutiny," she said, "and so that when tonight happened, the discovery of the hidden military record would look like I'd been hiding it, like part of the deception." He said it without particular heat, just the flat recognition of something he'd been living with for a while. "Who hired you?" "The job posting went through standard channels," he said. "HR intake, background check, standard process. But," he paused, "I've thought about this. Someone redirected the application. The original posting was for a level 2 technician. I was slotted into the senior prototype position 2 weeks after submitting. I got a call from someone in HR saying the role had expanded. I didn't ask questions because it was a better job. Someone elevated your clearance intentionally," she said, "gave you access to the Meridian specifically, and then removed the record that would have explained why I was qualified for that access." He looked at the facility. "Whoever built this plan thought about it for a long time." She thought about that, about the patience required to construct something with that many moving parts. The hire, the record erasure, the device installation, the demonstration timing, the breach team, the falsified contingency files. This wasn't improvised. This was months of construction, which meant Arthur Voss and Damian Cross had been sitting across tables from her for months, in board meetings and status reviews and quarterly presentations, while this was being built around her. She felt, for the first time that night, genuinely angry. Not the functional anger she'd been running on for the last several hours, the kind that serves as fuel that keeps you moving and thinking and making decisions. This was the other kind, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't immediately have anywhere to go. Ethan glanced at her. He didn't say anything, which was the right call. After a moment, she breathed out. "My company's lead software engineer," she said. "Lin Zhao. She's been with Titan Apex for 4 years. She built the internal data architecture, and she has a level of access to the system logs and transaction records that nobody else has." She paused. "I need to reach her tonight." "Why tonight?" He said it carefully, not pushing back, just asking. "Because Damian is in custody or en route to custody, and Arthur Voss is not yet, and there are financial transaction records somewhere in this company's systems that document exactly what was paid, when, to whom, and who authorized it. And those records have survived tonight intact because nobody knew to delete them. But they will know, soon, once the people involved start talking to their attorneys and making calls." She looked at Ethan. "If Lynn can pull those records and isolate them before someone with the access and the motive gets to them, you want to move before Voss does," he said. "I want the complete picture before anyone has the chance to redact it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Use mine. They've had your number from the start." She looked at the phone, then at him. "You think my line is still compromised?" "I think tonight is not the night to assume otherwise," he said. She took the phone, dialed Lin Zhao's number from memory, which she could do because she made a habit of memorizing the numbers of the 15 people in the company whose work was load-bearing. Lin picked up on the fourth ring, voice rough with interrupted sleep. "This is Vivian," she said. "I know it's midnight, and I know this is going to sound alarming, so I'll say this first. I'm safe. Now listen carefully, because I'm going to need you to do something tonight that cannot wait until morning." She heard Lynn sit up, the shift of sheets, the specific alert quality of someone whose mind engaged fast. "Tell me." Vivian told her. Lynn said almost nothing for 2 straight minutes, which Vivian had learned was her way of processing. Full absorption, no interruptions, questions after. When Vivian finished, Lynn said, "Financial transaction logs, authorization chains, deleted records from the last 12 months. Everything." "Give me 3 hours," Lynn said. "You have 2, Vivian said, "and pull anything that touches the security division budget, equipment procurement especially." "Understood." A pause. "Are you actually okay?" It was the first time anyone had asked it that way. Not "are you all right" in the procedural checking a box sense, but the actual question, the one that was asking about the person rather than the status. "I'll tell you when this is finished," Vivian said. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Ethan. Carver was walking toward them from the main entrance with the expression of someone who had new information and was deciding how much of it to share and in what sequence. "Cross's vehicle was located," she said. "He's in county custody. He came in voluntarily about 40 minutes ago, through his attorney's office." She paused. "He's going to cooperate, apparently, or claims he will." "Cooperation in exchange for what?" Ethan said. "His attorney hasn't specified yet," Carver said. "But Cross asked, apparently, about the status of the evidence, specifically whether the command logs were recoverable." She looked at Vivian. "When he was told they were already off-site and verified, his attorney says he, and I'm quoting this, sat down very slowly and asked for coffee." Vivian considered this. "He built his leverage on controlling the evidence, the manipulation, the competing narrative." She looked at the facility. "Without that, he doesn't have a play." "Seems that way," Carver said. "And Voss?" Vivian said. Carver's expression shifted. "Not yet." She'd expected that. It didn't make it easier. Somewhere out there, Arthur Voss was in his house or his car or his club, and he either knew the operation had failed or he was still waiting for a report that wasn't coming. Either way, he was calculating. That was what men like Arthur Voss did when they were afraid. They calculated. They called attorneys. They positioned. They didn't run because they'd spent their entire lives in environments where the right call was never run, always maneuver. She'd have to be faster and cleaner than that. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with the same steady attention he'd had all night, absorbing, calibrating, present without being intrusive. "I need a whiteboard," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Or paper, something to write on." She looked around the facility entrance. "I need to lay out the full chain, what we have, what Lynn is going to find, what Damien's cooperation potentially gives us, what we still need to connect Voss directly rather than by inference." She paused. "I work better when I can see it." Ethan reached into his jacket and produced, from an interior pocket, a small spiral notepad and a pen. The pen was slightly chewed at one end. She registered this detail without commenting on it. She took them both. "Thank you," she said. "I always carry one," he said. "Old habit." She didn't ask from where. She sat on the facility's front step. The concrete was cold through her clothes, and she was aware, for the first time in several hours, that she was quite physically tired, and she opened the notepad to the first page and started writing. The night was not over. Damien was in custody, but Voss was not. The evidence was safe, but not yet fully assembled. Lynn was running the financial records. Carver's team was processing the scene. Somewhere in the corporate infrastructure of Titan Apex Motors, a board chairman was making calls that would determine how the morning looked. She wrote it all down. Every line, every connection, every gap that still needed to be filled. Ethan sat on the step beside her, not looking at the notepad, looking out at the access road where the law enforcement vehicles were parked in a line that looked, from this angle, like an answer to a question the night had been asking since 8 o'clock. Neither of them spoke for a while. The facility lights were all on now. Every bay, every corridor, every corner of the building where 2 hours ago the dark had felt absolute. Light was simple. You restored power, and it came back, and the shadows went where shadows went. The other things, the 9 years of institutional trust that Damien Cross had spent, the months of planning that had gone into tonight, the question of how many people inside Titan Apex had known what was coming and said nothing, those didn't come back as quickly. Vivian kept writing, Ethan kept watch. That was how they'd divided the work all night, without ever discussing it. That was, she thought, exactly what it had been. Lin Zhao called back at 2:17 in the morning. Vivian was sitting in the passenger seat of one of the sheriff's vehicles. Not because she'd been told to, but because someone had offered it as a place to sit that wasn't a concrete step. And by that point, her body had registered enough opinions about the concrete step that she'd accepted. The heater was running. She had a cup of coffee that one of the deputies had produced from somewhere, and it was bad coffee, thin and slightly burnt, but it was warm, and she held it with both hands, and she was grateful for it in the uncomplicated way that you're grateful for small physical comforts when larger things are uncertain. Ethan was outside talking to Carver near the main entrance. She could see them through the windshield. 2 figures in the facility lights, their breath visible in the night air, the conversation quiet and methodical. She'd learned enough about both of them in the last several hours to know that whatever they were discussing was being handled with more competence than it would have been in the hands of most people she knew. When her phone rang, her own phone, because Carver had confirmed the line was clean and the communication risk had passed with Damien's custody. She looked at Lynn's name on the screen and felt something tighten in her chest. "Tell me," she said. "Okay." Lynn's voice had the quality it got when she'd been working hard for a sustained period. Focused, slightly stripped down, every unnecessary word cut away. "So, first thing, the financial transaction logs from the security division's budget. I found 14 separate payments over the last 11 months, ranging from $40,000 to $2.3 million, all authorized at CSO level and routed through a third-party vendor account that registers to a shell company incorporated in Delaware 8 months before the first payment hit." Vivian closed her eyes for 1 second. "And the shell company traces to—" "I can't complete that trace from inside our system," Lynn said. "That's going to need a forensic accountant with subpoena access, but I can tell you that the vendor account has no other clients, no public presence, and its registered agent is a law firm in D.C. that specializes in, a brief pause, the sound of keyboard clicks, corporate restructuring and acquisition advisory. Voss's firm of choice for board-level transactions, Vivian said. I noticed that too. She pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose. 11 months of payments, which meant this had been funded and moving before she'd had any indication, before the Meridian project had reached the demonstration stage, possibly before Damien had even identified Ethan Walker as the useful piece on the board. The deleted records, she said. The system logs. That took longer, Lynn said. Someone ran a selective deletion on the security division's internal access logs, specifically the logs from the 6-week window before tonight. Equipment sign-outs, facility access, device registrations. Whoever did it knew the system well enough to target the specific record types without touching adjacent logs, which is actually harder than it sounds. But you found them. I found the deletion event, Lynn said, which is different but almost as useful. The system logs a metadata record every time a deletion occurs. Timestamp, user credentials, what category of record was deleted. The deletion metadata wasn't touched, probably because whoever did it didn't know it existed or didn't think it would be forensically meaningful. A pause. The deletion was executed from a workstation in the Security Division's administrative office. The credentials used belonged to a senior analyst named Gareth Moss. Vivian pulled the notepad from her pocket. Moss. She wrote it down. Cross's people? Moss has been in the Security Division for 6 years, Lynn said. He reports to Cross's deputy, a woman named Sandra Park. I don't know if that means he was acting on instruction or on his own initiative, but either way, the digital trail leads to his credentials. That's enough for a start, Vivian said. What else? The device installation logs for the Meridian, Lynn said. Facility access records show 2 after-hours entries to Bay 7 in the 6-week window before tonight, both during Ethan Walker's scheduled days off, both using access credentials that weren't Walker's. She paused. The credentials belong to a technician named Dale Firth, who apparently has Bay 7 clearance as part of a legacy access group that should have been audited and trimmed 18 months ago, but wasn't. Firth, Vivian repeated, writing. He's on medical leave, has been for 2 months. I don't know if that's connected or coincidental. Note it either way. She shifted in the seat. Lynn, all of this, the transaction logs, the deletion metadata, the facility access records. Is it isolated? Already done, Lynn said. Everything is copied to encrypted offline storage, and I've locked the source records with admin-level protection that requires dual authorization to modify. Nobody's touching them without both of us approving it. Vivian exhaled, long and slow. You're incredible, she said. A brief silence. Lynn was not a person who responded to direct compliments gracefully. She tended to deflect or change the subject, which Vivian had always found oddly endearing in someone so technically formidable. I've been at this company for 4 years, Lynn said. I built half the systems someone just tried to use against you. Her voice carried something specific in it. Not anger exactly, something more contained. I'm going to need a very detailed explanation of everything that happened tonight, but I can wait until morning for that. Tomorrow, Vivian said, I'll tell you everything. Are you actually okay? The same question Vivian had heard earlier from Lynn and hadn't been able to answer. She still wasn't entirely sure, but she was clear on the parameters of it. I think so, she said. I'll let you know once I've slept. She ended the call and sat with the bad coffee and the heater and the sound of the facility outside. And she looked at the notepad in her lap. 14 payments, Shell Company, Moss and the deletion logs, Firth and the Bay 7 access, the full command data already on Carver's external server, the camera feeds, the call recording with Damien. It was a case, not a perfect one. There were gaps, and the gaps would matter when attorneys got involved. But it was a case, real, documented, with enough interlocking parts that pulling at any one of them would pull the others. She got out of the vehicle and walked back toward the main entrance, where Ethan and Carver were still talking. The night air hit her, and she registered, again, how tired she was. Not a collapsing tiredness, the functional kind, the kind you could still work through, but it was there.
Lynn found the financial records, she said as she reached them. 14 payments through a shell company over 11 months. Deletion metadata tracing to Cross's administrative office. Facility access logs placing an unauthorized entry into Bay 7 during Walker's off days. She looked at Carver. I'm going to need your financial crimes contacts information so Lynn can coordinate the document handover first thing in the morning. Carver was already writing. I'll get you a direct contact tonight. The shell company financials are going to take time to fully unravel, but if the registered agent traces to Voss's preferred firm, it does, Vivian said. Carver paused, just for a beat. Okay, she said, with the quality of someone adjusting a mental picture. That accelerates the Voss piece. How much? Enough, Carver said, which, from Carver, Vivian had learned, was the equivalent of considerably more effusive language from someone else. Ethan was watching her from a few feet away. She met his eyes. Good news? He said. Enough of it, she said. Lynn found the money trail. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly. He'd been carrying the situation with a kind of deliberate steadiness that didn't have obvious high and low points on the surface. But something underneath that steadiness adjusted, like a load being partially redistributed. What time is it? He said. She checked her phone. 2:40. He looked at the facility. The forensic team was still working inside. Through the high windows, she could see the evidence markers, the equipment, the careful, systematic movement of people doing their job properly. Bay 7's lights were on. The Meridian sat where it had been since the afternoon, at its crooked angle, the charcoal cover pulled back now, and the vehicle exposed to the facility lights and the investigators' cameras. I've been thinking about something, Ethan said. Tell me. The remote steering controller, the device installed in the vehicle. He looked at her. We've established when it was installed and by whose access. But the technical installation itself required someone who understood the Meridian's drive architecture. Dale Firth's access got someone into the bay, but the device integration into the steering controller isn't something you do without knowing the system. She saw where he was going. Someone with prototype-level technical knowledge helped. Or did it themselves, he said. The device was integrated at the firmware level, not a physical splice, not a crude tap. It was written into the control software. That requires access to the development environment. She stared at him. That's a much smaller pool of people. 6, maybe 7, who have that level of system access. He paused. I can give you the list. I've worked alongside every one of them for 8 months. Tomorrow morning, she said. When Carver's technical team is ready, I want you in the room when that conversation happens. He nodded. Then, after a moment, they're going to want to take a formal statement from me tonight. I know. My attorney... He stopped, started again. I don't have one. She looked at him. There was something almost uncomfortable in the straightforwardness of that. The simple fact of a person who had navigated tonight with extraordinary competence suddenly up against the one thing that competence didn't fix. My company's general counsel is awake, she said. He's been awake since I called him at 10:45. His name is David Park, and he has experience with exactly this kind of situation, and I'm going to call him right now and tell him that representing you tonight is his first priority. I don't need Ethan. She said it the way she'd said his name on the scrubland, outside the fence, when she'd told him to call his daughter, quiet and direct. You stayed in that building when everyone else left. You documented evidence that is going to be the backbone of a federal conspiracy case. And when law enforcement arrived, you surrendered immediately and answered every question openly. She paused. You did everything right. And you did it in a building where someone had spent months building a story that was designed to make you look like the villain. You need an attorney tonight before any formal statement is taken, and you're going to let me make that call. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't resistance, more like someone recalibrating the reflex that had led him to say he didn't need things. Okay, he said. She called David Park. He answered on the second ring, which confirmed that he had not, in fact, gone back to sleep since 10:45, which was not surprising and was actually useful. She gave him the 30-second version. Ethan Walker, mechanic,
instrumental in preserving evidence and protecting the CEO, false personnel records, potential target of a frame. And Park said 2 sentences. On my way to the scene. Nobody takes a formal statement from him until I'm there. She ended the call. 20 minutes, she said to Ethan. He nodded. He was looking at the facility again. She had the sense he did that when he was processing, oriented outward while the internal work happened. The Meridian, he said. What about it? Once the forensic team finishes with the vehicle, the drive system is going to need a full assessment. The remote controller will be pulled as evidence, but there may be secondary modifications, firmware changes, calibration adjustments, that need to be identified and remediated before the vehicle can be tested again. He paused. That's probably going to be a weeks-long process. I know. I want to lead it, he said. He said it without particular emphasis. Not a request with performance attached to it, just a statement of preference from someone who'd been 8 months into a project and didn't intend to leave it unfinished. You will, she said. He looked at her. You don't know yet how this is going to resolve, whether I'm... You will, she said again. The certainty in her own voice surprised her slightly. Not because she didn't mean it, she did, completely, but because 3 hours ago the certainty would have been complicated by questions she didn't have answers to. Now the picture was clear enough that the certainty felt straightforward, almost simple. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the facility. They stood there for a while in a silence that had a different quality than the silences of the last several hours. Those had been operational silences, full of listening, of calibration, of the particular alertness of people in a situation that was still actively dangerous. This one was different, quieter in a fuller way. At 3:10 a.m., David Park arrived in a car that clearly hadn't taken the speed limit as a firm suggestion. He was 53, compact, with the permanently slightly harried look of a man whose job was to be the person other people called when things went badly wrong. He shook Vivian's hand, assessed her condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd worked with her through a recall crisis and a board challenge, and said, "You look terrible." "Thank you, David. I mean it as a professional observation. When did you last eat?" She had no idea. "This isn't relevant." "It's slightly relevant." He turned to Ethan. "Your walker?" "Yeah." Park looked at him for approximately 4 seconds in the way that attorneys looked at clients before deciding how to proceed. "All right, before we go anywhere near a formal statement, I need 30 minutes with you. Everything you know, in sequence, starting from when you first noticed the unauthorized Base 7 access 6 weeks ago." He paused. "You reported it to your supervisor in writing, is that correct?" "Twice," Ethan said. "Do you have copies?" "They were on the facility's internal messaging system." He paused. "Which Lin Zhao has now isolated and locked." Park looked at Vivian. "Your systems engineer." "She's been awake since midnight pulling records." "Buy that woman a very expensive dinner," Park said. "Already planning it," Vivian said. Park took Ethan toward one of the sheriff's vehicles for the 30-minute debrief, and Vivian stood at the facility entrance and looked at the sky, which was doing the very early pre-dawn thing where the darkness at the horizon's edge was beginning to shift from black to something slightly less absolute. Not light yet. The suggestion of light eventually arriving, she was so tired, not in a way that frightened her, in the way that comes after something enormous, when the body finally submits a bill for everything the adrenaline was covering. Carver appeared beside her. "The 4 men in custody are being processed at county. 2 of them have already asked for separate legal representation, which usually means they're considering how the cooperation math works." She paused. "Cross's attorney has indicated he'll provide a formal cooperation proffer by 9 a.m., which is faster than I expected." "He knows the evidence," Vivian said. "He asked about it when he came in. Once they confirmed the data was off-site and verified, he understood the position he was in." "He's going to try to minimize his exposure by maximizing his value," Carver said. "That means he'll give us Voss." "Can you take it?" "Cooperation is cooperation," Carver said carefully. "What he gives us has to be verifiable and complete. If he's genuinely giving us the full structure, the payments, the planning timeline, the board members involved, then yes, it's usable." She paused.
It doesn't mean he walks. It means the sentencing math looks different. Good, Vivian said. He shouldn't walk. She said it without anger, just clarity. No, Carver agreed. He shouldn't. At 4:15, David Park finished with Ethan and came back to Vivian with an expression that she'd learned over 3 years meant he'd found something that changed his understanding of the situation. He reported those Bay 7 intrusions in writing, Park said. I've confirmed with your systems engineer that the messages exist and are preserved. 2 separate reports, 11 days apart, both explicitly flagging unauthorized access to the prototype vehicle and requesting escalation. He paused. Both received by his direct supervisor, one acknowledged, one not. And neither escalated. Neither escalated, Park confirmed. Which means Titan Apex Motors had documented internal warnings of potential prototype sabotage 6 weeks before tonight, and the chain of command, whether through complicity or deliberate suppression, failed to act on them. He looked at her directly. That's a corporate liability question, Vivian. Separate from the criminal matter? She absorbed this. How bad? Depends entirely on how the board responds going forward. If the company moves quickly, transparently, and cooperatively with the investigation, and if it can demonstrate that the failure was a deliberate conspiracy rather than systemic negligence, manageable. He paused. If it drags or obscures, or the board makes bad decisions in the next 72 hours, significantly worse. The board is meeting at 7 a.m., she said. Park blinked. You've called an emergency board meeting for 7 a.m. I called it an hour ago, she said. They don't know the full picture yet. They'll know it at 7. He was quiet for a moment. Arthur Voss is still... Voss will not be at that meeting, she said. I'm having his board access suspended as of 6 a.m. pending the federal investigation. She paused. I have the authority to do that as CEO under Section 12 of the company's governance charter, in cases where a board member is under active federal inquiry. Park looked at her for a moment. You've been thinking about this for the last 2 hours. I've been thinking about this since Damien said his name on the phone, she said. I've just been waiting to have enough to move. Do you have enough? The financial records Lynn pulled, the shell company registration, Damien's statement on the recorded call, and the fact that federal investigators are currently treating Voss as a person of interest? She met Park's eyes. Yes, I have enough. Park did something she hadn't seen him do very often in 3 years. He smiled. Small and specific. The kind that was about professional respect rather than warmth. 7 a.m., he said. I'll be there. She went to find Ethan. He was standing near the Meridian's bay. The forensic team had finished with Bay 7 and the investigators were packing equipment, which meant the immediate scene work was winding down. The Meridian sat there, the charcoal cover fully pulled away now, under the full facility lights. She stood beside him and looked at the car. It was, she realized, still a beautiful piece of engineering. The steering lockup and the remote controller and everything that had been built around it hadn't changed the fundamental thing the car was. It had just put it in a situation it hadn't been built for. She thought there might be a parallel in there worth examining at a time when she had the mental space for it. The firmware modifications, she said. The ones that would need to be remediated before the vehicle is testable again. How long, realistically? Ethan looked at the car. 3 weeks for the full assessment, another 2 to remediate and verify, then retesting from scratch. He paused. Could be compressed if you have the full team on it. You'll have the full team, she said. He nodded, looked at the car for another moment. Why the Meridian? He said. She glanced at him. As the target, he said. They could have chosen any vehicle in the lineup, any project. Why this one? She'd thought about this. The Meridian is the first vehicle developed entirely under my leadership. It's the most visible proof of concept for the direction I've taken the company. If it fails publicly and catastrophically, she paused. It's not just a product failure. It's an argument that I don't know what I'm doing, that the company is better off under different management. Ethan was quiet. Damien said tonight wasn't about the car, she said. He was right. It was never about the car. It was about what the car represented. And what does it represent now, he said. She looked at the meridian, the clean lines of it, the engineering precision that 68 people had put into it, the 3 years of work that had survived a steering lockup and a building breach and an armed conspiracy and a night that had tried very hard to end it. 3 weeks for the assessment, she said, 2 more to remediate, then retesting. He almost smiled. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now that I'm confident in, she said. He nodded slowly, as if that was a reasonable position. The sky outside the facility's high windows was definitively lighter now. Not dawn yet, but the hour before it, when the darkness became a deep blue gray and the outlines of things became visible again. She'd been in this facility for what was approaching 14 hours if you counted from her 3:15 arrival. She was going to need a change of clothes before the 7 a.m. board meeting, which meant she had approximately 2.5 hours for the drive back, the change, and whatever passed for preparation. She also, she realized, had not eaten since lunch yesterday. This was the kind of logistical reality that arrived late and felt slightly absurd when it did. I need to go, she said. Board meeting in less than 3 hours. She looked at him. Park will be with you for the formal statement. Don't say anything before he's in the room. I know, he said. The statement is going to be long, she said, and then they're probably going to want you available while they process the scene, which means today is going to be, I know, he said again, not impatiently, just confirming that he'd done this calculation already. She started to turn, stopped. Ethan? He looked at her. When this is over, when the statements are done and the investigation is running and the board meeting is finished, I need you to write down everything you reported to your supervisor 6 weeks ago. Every detail. Not for the investigation, though that too. I want to know what you saw and when you saw it and what the response was, because that's a failure inside my company, and I need to understand it completely. He held her gaze. I'll write it. And the list of engineers with development environment access, she said. The ones who could have done the firmware modification. I'll have it ready. She nodded. The professional check-ins were done. She'd covered the practical ground. But she stood there for another second because the practical ground wasn't quite all of it, and the thing she wanted to say was sitting at an angle to the practical that made it harder to deliver cleanly. You could have left, she said. When it started, when the lights went out. You'd reported the intrusions, you'd flagged the issues, you'd done what your job required. Nobody would have... I know, he said quietly. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything about what you were thinking, she said. But I want you to know that I understand what it cost. Not just tonight, the months before tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere in the facility, a radio crackled and someone responded to it and the sound bounced off the steel walls and faded. My daughter, he said, not completing the sentence immediately, just beginning it and letting it sit there. Riley, Vivian said, she asks me sometimes why I don't work somewhere that doesn't require me to keep my phone on all night. He paused. I've never been able to explain it to her in a way that made complete sense. What do you tell her? That the work matters, he said, and that there's a difference between work that matters and work that's just necessary. She thought about that, filed it. Tonight mattered, she said. Yeah, he said. It did. She left him there, in the bay with the meridian and the fading forensic markers and the approaching dawn, and she walked out through the main entrance into a morning that was beginning to lay its gray-blue light across the scrubland and the access road and the long horizon. And she got into the car that her assistant, who had returned at some point in the last hour without being asked, simply appeared, which was what good assistants did, had pulled around to the entrance. The drive back was 43 miles, and she spent the first 20 of them looking at the notepad in her lap, the list she'd been building since midnight, payments, names, record deletions, access logs, firmware modifications, the shape of a conspiracy that had been under construction for 11 months. She spent the last 23 miles not looking at it, thinking instead about a mechanic who had memorized a floor plan because he couldn't make himself not do it, who had built an auxiliary routing system because the formally recognized protocols weren't enough, who had carried a spiral notepad with a chewed pen because it was an old habit, and some habits were worth keeping. The board meeting was in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Arthur Voss would not be there. Damian Cross would not be there. The evidence would be. And Vivian Sterling, who who had walked into a testing facility 14 hours ago thinking the hardest thing about the night would be managing a failed demonstration, had something she hadn't had when the lights went out at 8 p.m. Every piece she needed. The board meeting started at 7 o'clock exactly. Not 7:02. Not 7:05 with everyone still finding their seats and checking their phones. 7 o'clock, because Vivian had told her assistant to lock the conference room doors at 7, and that was what happened. 9 board members present, 3 joining remotely on the screen at the far end of the room, and 1 empty chair at the head of the table's right side, where Arthur Voss had sat for 11 years and would not be sitting today or any day following. Nobody asked about the empty chair immediately. They were all looking at Vivian, who stood at the front of the room in a change of clothes that she'd put on 40 minutes ago, with a cup of coffee she'd actually drunk most of, and the specific quality of stillness that came from having been awake for 26 hours on the far side of something enormous. She'd looked at herself in the mirror before leaving the building and had made the conscious decision not to do much about what she saw there. She'd washed her face. She'd changed. The rest of it, the tiredness around her eyes, the absence of the professional polish she normally carried into board presentations, she'd left alone. It felt this morning like the right call. Like wearing armor when you've already won would be a particular kind of dishonesty. David Park sat to her left. He had a tablet and a printed document set and the expression of a man who had not slept, but had used the time productively. "Thank you all for coming," Vivian said, which was pro forma, because they hadn't had a choice. But courtesy didn't require sincerity to be worth extending. "I'm going to ask you to listen for about 30 minutes before anyone asks questions, because what I'm going to tell you is complex and it needs to be heard in sequence to make full sense." Margaret Lund, the longest-serving remaining board member at 67, a former aerospace executive who had a reputation for getting to the point and an equally strong reputation for not being impressed by things that were supposed to be impressive, looked at Vivian over the top of reading glasses she was wearing for reasons that appeared to be structural since she hadn't actually read anything yet. "Where is Arthur?" "Arthur Voss's board access has been suspended as of 6 a.m. this morning," Vivian said, "pending a federal investigation into his involvement in last night's events at the Meridian facility. His legal representation has been notified. That's all I'm going to say about him until I've given you the full picture." The room did various things with this information. Some faces went carefully neutral. Some went genuinely alarmed. One, a man named Robert Chen, who managed the company's Northeast distribution relationships and had always struck Vivian as professionally pleasant in a way that didn't reveal much beneath it, went very still in a manner that was specifically different from careful neutrality. She noted that, filed it. 30 minutes, she said. Then questions. She told them everything. Not in the emotional register she'd used with Carver, or the abbreviated version she'd given her communications head, or the clinical summary she'd given Park. She told it the way she'd been organizing it in her head for the last 6 hours. The architecture of it, the timeline, the decisions that had been made, and by whom and on what authorization. The steering failure and why it wasn't mechanical. The breach and who had enabled it. The personnel record and who had erased it and why. The device registration and the command logs and the shell company and the 14 payments. Damian Cross in custody, cooperation proffer filed, 4 men arrested, 1 additional operative in custody as of 2:45 a.m. The 5th man, Reyes, apprehended attempting to plant falsified evidence in the data room. She showed them the transaction logs Lynn had pulled. She showed them the facility access records. She played 40 seconds of the recorded call with Damian, specifically the section where he named Arthur Voss and described the board-level involvement, and she watched the room receive it. Margaret Lund had not moved for the last 15 minutes. She was looking at the table surface in front of her with the expression of someone doing a very large and unpleasant calculation. When Vivian finished, she said, "Questions." There were many. Some of them were good questions, targeted, relevant, probing the specific gaps and implications of what she'd presented. Margaret asked most of those. A board member named David Okafor, who handled investor relations, asked about the public disclosure timeline, which was the right question from his position. A woman named Claire Ashworth, representing the pension fund that held a significant equity stake,
asked about the legal exposure of board members who hadn't been involved but had failed to identify a conspiracy operating at the chairman level. That was also the right question, though the right answer was complicated. The bad questions were also present. 2 board members, both of whom had been at the company longer than Vivian, and both of whom she'd always sensed were more loyal to the institutional memory of the company Voss had known than to the company it had become. Asked questions that were structurally about the evidence, but were actually about whether all of this might be more complicated than it appeared. Whether Damian Cross might have motivations that colored his cooperation proffer. Whether the shell company connection was as direct as it seemed. Vivian answered those questions with the same even register as the others, because she'd been expecting them and because the evidence didn't require her to be defensive about it. Evidence stood or didn't stand on its own merits. When you had enough of it, you didn't need to argue. Robert Chen didn't ask any questions. She noticed that too. The meeting ran 94 minutes. At the end of it, the board voted, 8-0 with Chen abstaining, to affirm Vivian's authority to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, to retain outside legal counsel for the company's independent representation, and to establish an emergency governance committee to oversee board operations during the investigation period. It wasn't unanimous. Chen's abstention sat in the room like a small stone someone had dropped and not picked up. After the meeting, in the corridor outside, Margaret Lund caught up with Vivian and walked beside her in silence for about 8 feet before speaking. "Robert Chen," she said. "I know," Vivian said. "He managed the distribution relationships for the Northeast Territory. 3 of the vendors in that region do significant business with the same law firm in D.C. that registered the shell company." Margaret paused. "I don't know what that means yet, but I know what it might mean." "I'll pass it to Carver this morning," Vivian said. Margaret was quiet for another moment. When she spoke again, it had a different quality. Less the board member processing a governance crisis, more the older woman who had been in this industry for decades, and occasionally let that show. "Marcus thought you were ready," she said. "I voted to support the transition because Marcus asked me to and because your record suggested he was right. I want you to know that I had questions then that I didn't voice because I was uncertain, and I thought I was giving you the benefit of the doubt." She paused. "What I was actually doing was reserving judgment." Vivian looked at her. "I'm not reserving anything now," Margaret said. "Whatever you need from me for the next 6 months, investigative cooperation, governance support, public statements, whatever is useful. Tell me and I'll do it." Vivian held the older woman's gaze and felt something she wasn't entirely prepared for. Not gratitude exactly, though it was in the neighborhood of that. The specific weight of being seen by someone who had every professional reason to see clearly and had chosen to say so out loud. "Thank you," she said. Margaret nodded once in the way of someone who considers the matter settled and walked away down the corridor. Vivian stood there for a moment. Then she checked her phone and went to work. The 6 weeks that followed were not clean. Clean would have been the wrong word for them, and anyone who described them as such wasn't paying attention to what was actually happening. They were productive weeks, and they were necessary weeks, and some things in them went better than expected, while others went worse. And the overall shape of them was not linear in the way that accounts of complicated situations sometimes made them appear in retrospect. The federal investigation expanded. Damian Cross's cooperation proffer, as Carver had predicted, was comprehensive and moved fast. He gave the investigators the full payment structure, the planning timeline, the names of the board members who had attended a series of private meetings at a members' club in the city over the preceding 14 months, where the outline of the conspiracy had been drawn up and revised and eventually executed. 3 other board members besides Voss were named. One of them was Robert Chen, which confirmed what Margaret had implied in the corridor without making it satisfying. Arthur Voss was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 17 days after the breach, at his house. Vivian heard about it from Carver, who sent a text that said simply, "Voss in custody. Arraignment tomorrow." She was in the middle of a Meridian remediation review when she read it, sitting at a conference table in Bay 7 with 3 engineers and Ethan Walker on one side of the table and Lin Zhao and 2 members of the technical team on the other. She read the text and set the phone face down on the table and looked at the schematic in front of her and said, "Okay, What's the firmware status on the secondary steering controller? She didn't mention the text until the meeting was over. Ethan noticed she'd received it. He didn't ask about it during the meeting. He did, when they were the last two people in the room and she was closing her laptop. Look at her with a question in his eyes that wasn't quite a question. Voss is in custody, she said. He nodded slowly. How do you feel about that? She thought about it. Genuinely, instead of defaulting to the professional answer, which would have been something about justice and the proper functioning of legal processes. Tired, she said. Mostly tired. He absorbed this without trying to improve it, which she appreciated. The firmware is at 60%, he said after a moment. Lynn's team found 2 secondary modifications we didn't catch in the first pass. It's going to push the remediation timeline by about 4 days. So, 3 weeks and 4 days, she said. Give or take. Tell me about the modifications. They talked about the firmware for 20 minutes, standing at the conference table with the Bay 7 lights humming above them, and somewhere in the middle of it she understood that this, the specific normalcy of it, the return to the work itself, was actually the thing she'd been waiting for without knowing how to name it. Not the arrest, not the board vote, not any of the legal and institutional processes that were moving forward in the background like heavy machinery. The work. The fact that the work was still here and was still worth doing. David Park handled the corporation's legal coordination with a competence that justified every year of his retainer, and then some. The company's public statement, released on day 4 after Carver's team had cleared the basic outlines for disclosure, was drafted by Vivian personally and then refined with her communications head through 7 iterations until every sentence was doing exactly what she needed it to do and nothing it didn't. It named the conspiracy directly. It identified the company's own security division as the operational vector. It committed to full cooperation with the federal investigation. And it said explicitly, in a paragraph that she'd written herself and that she'd have taken out of the final draft over her own professional objection before she'd let anyone soften it, that the events of that night had been identified and disrupted in significant part because of the actions of a company employee named Ethan Walker, whose vigilance, documentation, and decision-making under pressure had preserved the evidence that exposed the full scope of the conspiracy. She'd shown Ethan a draft before it was released. He'd read it in her office, standing at the window with the city visible behind him, and when he'd finished, he'd been quiet for a while. You don't have to put my name in it, he said. I know, she said. I'm putting it in anyway. He'd handed the draft back without arguing. She'd noticed he'd read the paragraph about himself twice. On day 19, Lin Zhao presented the complete financial forensics to the federal team. 340 pages of documented transactions, authorization chains, and metadata analysis that she had assembled with the methodical precision of someone who had built the system being analyzed and understood exactly where every piece of information lived and what it was connected to. Carver's financial crimes contact described it, in a message to Vivian relayed through Park, as the cleanest third-party financial forensics package he'd seen in 14 years of federal investigations. Lynn, when Vivian told her this, said, I made 17 errors in the first draft. The clean version took longer than the initial poll. That's not the part he was commenting on, Vivian said. It's the part that matters, Lynn said. Vivian bought her a dinner anyway. Very expensive, as Park had suggested. Lynn spent most of it talking about the secondary firmware modifications, which Vivian did not mind at all. The Meridian remediation completed on day 25, 3 days ahead of the revised timeline, because Ethan had identified an efficiency in the verification process that compressed 2 sequential steps into one, without sacrificing the methodology. He'd explained it at a team meeting with a whiteboard and a marker, and the particular directness of someone who saw the solution clearly and simply wanted to communicate it accurately. And afterward, one of the junior engineers had said, slightly dazed, How did you see that? And Ethan had shrugged and said, I've been looking at it long enough. Vivian had been in the back of the room for that meeting. She'd gone in to check on something specific, and had stayed because the meeting was interesting, and because she'd developed, over the past several weeks, a mild habit of being in whatever room Ethan Walker happened to be working in when the circumstances permitted it. She hadn't examined that habit very closely. She was a person with a functional relationship to her own psychology. which meant she knew what examining it would probably reveal and was choosing for the moment to let it exist without categorizing it. On day 31, she called Ethan into her office. He sat across the desk from her in the chair that visiting executives used, which was a chair he'd sat in 3 times in the past month for operational updates. And he looked at her with the patient alertness that was his default mode and waited. "I want to propose a structural change," she said. "The safety division," he said. He'd known it was coming. She'd discussed the outline with him once, briefly, during the Meridian remediation, and he'd been thinking about it since then. She could tell from the way he said it. Not surprised. Ready. "An independent safety and security division," she said, "separate from the existing security infrastructure which is being restructured as part of the post-investigation remediation. The new division would have a direct reporting line to me, independent budget authority, and a mandate that covers both physical security and the integrity of our vehicle development systems." She paused. "I want you to lead it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm a mechanic." "You're a mechanical engineer with 8 years of Navy SEAL operational experience, a demonstrated ability to identify systemic security failures in advance of the people whose job it was to find them, and an 8-month record of building parallel safety architecture on your own initiative because the formal systems were inadequate." She paused. "You're also the person who preserved the evidence that took down a board-level conspiracy, and you did it with a ruggedized laptop and a maintenance supply rack." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have a management background," he said. "I'll get you the support you need on that side," she said. "What I can't get elsewhere is the judgment." He looked out the window. The city was doing the thing it did at this particular hour in the late afternoon, the light going golden and specific across the buildings. And she watched him think in the way she'd come to recognize, the slight stillness, the inward focus. "One condition," he said. "Tell me." "I keep working on the vehicles." He looked back at her. "Not full-time, not in the same capacity, but I need to stay connected to the engineering work. The safety function only works if I actually understand what I'm protecting, and that understanding comes from being in the bays, not the conference rooms." She'd expected something harder than that, something she'd have to negotiate. "Yes," she said. "And I leave at 4:30, he said. "Every day that I don't have an actual operational emergency. Riley has a thing about dinner." 4:30, she said. "Non-negotiable from your end." He almost did the thing that wasn't quite a smile, and then it went all the way and became an actual one. Small and specific and slightly surprised, as if his own face had done something he hadn't authorized. "Okay," he said. She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. It was not a dramatic moment. It was the kind of moment that mattered specifically because it wasn't dramatic. 2 people in an office making a practical agreement about work, the handshake less a ceremony than a confirmation of something that had already been understood. The Meridian launched on day 43, not to the public. That was still 6 months away, pending the final testing phase and the production schedule. But to a closed group, the engineering team, the remaining board members, selected investors, and the 24 people who had kept the company functioning through 6 weeks of legal turbulence and institutional uncertainty while doing their actual jobs simultaneously. Vivian had insisted on that list. She'd also insisted on doing the thing in Bay 7 of the Meridian facility, on the same track where Castellano had brought the car to a stop 11 feet from the wall 7 weeks ago. She'd gotten some gentle pushback on the location choice. Her communications head had suggested the company's main testing facility at headquarters. A board member had suggested a neutral off-site venue to avoid the associations. She'd listened to both suggestions and proceeded with her original choice, because the associations were exactly the point. You didn't run from the place where something hard had happened. You went back there and did the next thing. Castellano drove. He came out of the hairpin at 68 miles per hour, controlled and clean, and the Meridian held the line like it had been designed to hold it. And the telemetry on the observation screens showed green across every metric, and the room, if rooms could have a collective quality, released something it had been holding for a long time. Vivian was standing at the observation glass. She'd positioned herself in almost the exact spot she'd been standing when the car had locked up in that same corner 7 weeks ago, and she'd done it deliberately, and she was aware that was probably a psychological thing she could interrogate later. Ethan was 2 feet to her left. He'd been watching the telemetry more than the car. "Green," he said. "Green," she confirmed. They watched Castellano come around for a second lap. "How's the new division shaping up?" she said. "Slowly," he said. "I hired a deputy last week, former Federal Infrastructure Security. She's going to take the administrative side, which means I actually have to explain what I do instead of just doing it." "How's that going?" "Terrible," he said. "I'm not good at explaining things I do by instinct." "You explained the firmware efficiency to a room of engineers with a whiteboard." "That's engineering. Engineering has a logic you can point at." He paused. "The other stuff. Threat assessment. System integrity. He made a slight gesture with one hand that she understood to mean the whole accumulated weight of pattern recognition and experience that had kept them both alive 6 weeks ago. "That's harder to put in a training document." "You'll figure it out," she said. "Probably," he said. "Eventually." Castellano came around for a third lap. Smoother this time, like the car was remembering itself. "Riley asked about you," Ethan said. Vivian looked at him. "What?" "Last week, she'd seen the news coverage, not the detailed version, she's 8, but enough to understand there was something. She asked if you were okay." He paused. "I told her yes. She said, 'Is she nice?' And I said yes, and she said, 'Does she know you fixed her car?'" Vivian looked back at the track. The Meridian was on its 4th lap now, Castellano finding the rhythm of it, the car doing exactly what it had been built to do. She felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately try to name. "She knows," she said. They stood in the observation bay while the engineers around them began the technical debrief, the room warming up with the specific energy of people who had worked on something for a long time and were watching it work, and neither of them said anything else for a while. It wasn't that kind of silence. It was the other kind, the kind that didn't need anything added to it. 3 months later, Damian Cross entered a formal guilty plea on 4 federal counts: conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, obstruction of justice, unlawful facilitation of a facility breach, and wire fraud related to the shell company payments. The sentencing guidelines suggested 7 to 12 years. His cooperation had moved the needle downward on his own exposure while simultaneously handing the prosecution an airtight case against everyone above him in the structure. Arthur Voss went to trial. He retained the most expensive defense team available, which was his right, and the trial ran 6 weeks, which was 3 weeks longer than the prosecution had projected. The defense's argument, that Voss had been broadly aware of discussions about leadership transition but had not specifically authorized the operational elements of the conspiracy, was, the jury decided after 4 days of deliberation, not supported by the financial records, the cooperation testimony, the shell company registration, or the 11 months of documented planning that preceded the breach. Guilty on 5 counts. Vivian heard the verdict in her office, from Park, who called the moment it was read. She thanked him. She sat at her desk for about 4 minutes after the call, not doing anything specific, just sitting there. Then she got up and walked down to the Bay 7 Annex, where Ethan was in the middle of a safety protocol review with 2 members of his new division, and she knocked on the open door. He looked up. "Verdict," she said. He read her expression. "Guilty?" "5 counts." He nodded slowly. The 2 people with him looked at each other without fully understanding the context, but understanding the weight of the moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She went back to her office and got back to work. That was the thing about institutions. They didn't pause for their own histories. The company had a production schedule, a marketing timeline, a 6-month runway to the Meridian's public launch. The independent safety division had a staffing build-out and a protocol architecture that Ethan was assembling with the same methodical patience he'd applied to everything else. Lin Zhao was 3 months into a complete audit of the company's data architecture, rebuilding the internal systems with security layers that would have made the original conspiracy considerably harder to execute. The board had been restructured. Margaret Lund was interim chair, a position she'd accepted with an expression that suggested she found it mildly annoying and fully necessary. The work kept going.
It was the only thing that actually carried anything forward. 5 months after the breach, on a Wednesday in early spring, Vivian was leaving the office at 6:30 when she passed the parking structure elevator and found Ethan waiting for it. He was carrying a light jacket and had the look of a man who was approximately 90 seconds late for something and was doing the math on whether it was recoverable. 4:30, she said. Safety review ran long, he said. It's fine, Mrs. Calder has her until 7. He looked at his watch. Maybe 7:15. Where are you going for dinner? That Thai place on Meridian Avenue, he said, and then caught himself. Not named for the car. It's been there since the 80s. I know the one, she said. The elevator arrived. They both got in, which meant they were going to the same parking level, which was not surprising since the executive and senior staff spaces were on the same floor. She pushed the button. The elevator did what elevators did. Riley's been asking about the Meridian, he said. The car. I told her it was fixed. She can come see it, Vivian said. If she wants. Bring her in sometime. I'll have someone give her the full Bay 7 tour. He looked at her. She'd love that. Saturday, Vivian said. If that works, I'm in the office until noon. He seemed slightly surprised, though he was getting better at not showing surprise, or possibly just had less reason to be surprised by the things she said than he'd had in the early weeks. Saturday works, he said. The elevator opened. They walked out into the parking structure and the cool air of an early spring evening, and their cars were in opposite directions, and they paused at the split. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. She walked to her car, unlocked it, sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting it, looking at the concrete column in front of her in the half-dark of the parking structure. She'd asked Marcus Hale about Ethan eventually. Not right away. She'd waited until the immediate legal situation had settled enough that the question felt like information gathering rather than something else. She'd called him on a Tuesday evening and he'd answered from what sounded like a boat, the specific quality of marine air in the background, and she'd said, The hire you set up, Ethan Walker, senior prototype mechanic. A pause. I didn't set up any hire, Marcus had said. She'd held the phone for a moment. His personnel file shows your authorization code on the access elevation, the one that moved him from level 2 application to the Meridian position. Vivian, Marcus had said carefully, my authorization code was retired when I handed the company over. I haven't had access to the HR system in 3 years. She'd processed this. Someone used your code. Apparently. Another pause. Though, for what it's worth, however he ended up in that position, he was the right person to be in it. Wouldn't you say? She hadn't answered that question on the call. She'd thanked Marcus and ended it and spent a while sitting with the information, which didn't change the facts but did add a layer to the picture. The code had been used, whether by Damien, who had access to legacy authorization data through the security division, or by someone else in the structure, to place Ethan in a position where his expertise was accessible and his visibility was controlled. Whether that had been intended to exploit him or to plant him in a role where he'd eventually be useful as a fall guy was something the investigation had determined, the latter. The intent had been to frame him. What the people who built that frame had failed to account for was what happened when you put a person of actual integrity into a position of access, and they used it the way integrity dictated. She thought about that sometimes, about how the conspiracy had tried to use Ethan as a piece in a plan he didn't know about, and how the plan had collapsed precisely because of the kind of person he turned out to be. The thing they'd chosen as an instrument had its own character, its own compass, and when the moment came, that compass had pointed exactly where it needed to. She started the car and drove out of the parking structure into the spring evening. The city was doing the thing it did when the weather turned. More people on the sidewalks, the particular loosening of a place that had been held tight through the cold months. She took the long way home, through the commercial district and the park, because she wasn't in a hurry and because sometimes the long way was the right way. She was 30 years old. She had been the CEO of Titan Apex Motors for 3 years and 4 months. She had survived a board challenge and a supplier collapse and a product recall, and most recently, an armed conspiracy coordinated by the chairman of her own board and executed through her own security division. The Meridian was 5 months from its public launch,
and the engineering data suggested it was going to perform exactly as designed. She had a company that was working on being worth the trust people had put in it. She had a safety division led by a man who had shown her what it looked like to stay in a room when leaving was available and easier. She had Lin Zhao running a data architecture that would take considerably more than a shell company and a few months of planning to compromise. She had Margaret Lund in the interim chair position, which was not a comfortable situation for anyone, but was the right one. She was not comfortable with comfortable as a general principle. Comfortable was where the blind spots grew. She thought about what Damien had said on the phone in the moment before he'd calculated that the conversation was being recorded and had stopped saying real things. You're 30 years old and you've been CEO for 3 years. As if the years were an argument against her. As if the amount of time she'd been doing something was the measure of whether she was doing it right. She'd spent some time being angry about that, and then she'd spent less time being angry about it, and now she mostly just thought it was a particular kind of limited thinking. The belief that longevity was the same as legitimacy, that being there first meant you understood it better, that the person who'd inherited a position was less real than the one who'd built their way into it, as if Vivian Sterling had been handed something rather than having fought daily for 3 years, in a company that hadn't been designed with her in mind, to build something that was actually hers. It was hers now. That had been tested as thoroughly as anything could be tested. She pulled into her building's parking garage, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet for a moment. Saturday, she'd bring Riley Walker into Bay 7 and show her the car. Riley, who was 8 years old and thought her father fixed fast cars, which was not entirely inaccurate, as Ethan had said on a cold floor in the dark, when everything was still uncertain and the choice he'd made was still very new. Some things were worth showing an 8-year-old, not because children needed to understand corporate conspiracy or federal investigations or the internal politics of automotive companies, but because they deserved, sometimes, to see what their parents had actually done, to understand even partially why the choice mattered. Ethan Walker had a chewed pen in his jacket pocket and a daughter who asked about other people's well-being and a way of moving through rooms like he was keeping track of all of them simultaneously. He had a military history that someone had tried to erase and a work record that spoke in the plain language of a person who showed up and did what was needed. He was not an easy person to know, she'd learned, not because he was closed, but because the things that mattered most to him he kept carefully, like objects you don't put in the window because the window is not the point. She admitted to herself in the parking garage, interested in knowing him better. That was the honest version. She got out of the car and went upstairs and made dinner and went to sleep at 10:30, which was the earliest she'd gone to sleep in 5 weeks, and she didn't dream about anything she could remember in the morning. The Meridian launched publicly 4.5 months later, on a Thursday in late summer, at a facility that wasn't the Meridian testing facility and wasn't chosen for symbolic reasons or the avoidance of them. It was chosen because it was the right size and the right location, and the logistics worked. Vivian spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about the engineering team and the 3 years of development and the testing process and what the vehicle represented for the company's direction. She did not talk about the 6 weeks in the middle that had tried to stop it from existing. That story existed in court records and federal filings and the public statement Titan Apex had released, and anyone who wanted to understand what the car had come through to reach this launch could find it. She didn't need to narrate it. The car was there. That was the narration. After the launch event, standing at the edge of the reception area, Ethan appeared beside her with 2 glasses of whatever the caterers were pouring and handed her one. "Good speech," he said. 11 minutes, she said. "I kept it to 11 minutes. I noticed." He looked at the Meridian on the display platform at the center of the room. Full production model, the charcoal color of the cover they'd draped over the prototype replaced by a deep metallic blue that the design team had chosen. "You didn't mention the facility." "No. Good call." "I thought so." She looked at the car. "Riley's drawing is still on my desk." He almost did something with his expression. "She's going to be embarrassed about that in about 6 years. The drawing of the car with the lightning bolts? The one where she wrote your name in purple crayon on the back," he said. "She does that with drawings she considers significant." Vivian had, in fact, turned the drawing over and read the name, which was printed in the specific all caps of a child who is being deliberate about something. She had not mentioned this.
Tell her thank you, she said. Tell her yourself, he said. She's been asking when you're coming to dinner. She looked at him. He was looking at the car, not at her, with the expression she'd learned was not indifference but something closer to its opposite, a feeling significant enough that it required the sideways angle. When? She said. Saturday, he said, if that works. She wants to make pasta, which means it's going to be approximately 60% edible, but the effort is genuine. She felt something happen in her chest that was not complex or ambiguous.
Just warm, in the specific, uncomplicated way that warm things felt when you'd been cold for a long time and had mostly stopped noticing. Saturday works, she said. They stood there in the reception area of a vehicle launch that had taken 3 years and 6 weeks of crisis and 5 months of rebuilding to arrive at, and around them the room had the particular sound of an evening that was going well, conversation and movement and the satisfaction of something finished. The Meridian sat on its platform under the lights, metallic blue and precisely engineered and more than a little hard won. Vivian lifted her glass. Ethan lifted his. Neither of them said anything about what they were toasting. They didn't need to. Some things were complete enough on their own that putting words to them would only reduce them. Outside, the summer evening was doing what summer evenings did, long and slow, the light lasting longer than expected, the air carrying the suggestion that something was still beginning even at the end of a day. It was that kind of night, the kind that, looking back later, you recognized as the place where one thing finished and something else started to become visible. Not in a dramatic way, not with ceremony, just the ordinary way that things changed, quietly, while you were paying attention to something else, until you looked up and realized the shape of the world had shifted slightly, and you were glad of it. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough.